Allegory of the Cave. Plato's Allegory of the Cave is one of the most famous philosophical metaphors, illustrating how humans perceive reality and the struggle to attain true knowledge. Imagine a dark cave where prisoners have been chained since birth, unable to move their heads. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, objects are carried, casting shadows on the cave wall. The prisoners, never having seen anything else, mistake these shadows for reality. To them, a moving shadow of a book is a book. They know nothing of the real world outside the cave. One day a prisoner is freed and dragged outside. At first, the sunlight blinds him. He struggles to accept that the objects he now sees, trees, animals, the sky, are more real than the shadows he once believed to be the full extent of existence. Over time, he realizes the truth. The world outside the cave is vast and full of genuine forms, while the cave was an illusion. If he returns to free the others, they may not believe him. They might even resist, preferring their familiar but false world. Plato uses this story to illustrate the difference between appearance and reality. Most people live in ignorance, mistaking perceptions for truth. The journey out of the cave represents enlightenment, learning to see beyond illusions. It's a painful but necessary process, revealing that wisdom requires breaking free from comforting but deceptive beliefs. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of identity and change over time. Theseus, a legendary Greek hero, owned a grand wooden ship. Over many years, the ship's planks began to rot, so one by one, they were replaced with new planks. Eventually, every single part of the ship had been replaced. The question arises, is it still the same ship? Now, imagine all the original planks were carefully stored and later used to reconstruct an identical ship. This leads to another question. Which one is the real ship of Theseus? The one that had its parts replaced gradually, or the one rebuilt with the original materials? This dilemma explores the nature of identity. If something slowly changes over time but retains continuity, is it still the same? This applies beyond ships, to people, objects, and even personal identity. Our bodies replace cells constantly, yet we consider ourselves the same person over decades. But if identity is tied to physical continuity, does a reconstructed version of something count as the original? The Ship of Theseus highlights the fluidity of identity. Philosophers debate whether things remain the same when altered, or if identity is tied to the sum of its parts at a single moment. In modern times, this thought experiment applies to AI, cloning, and even personal transformation. How much can we change before we're no longer the same? The trolley problem. The trolley problem is one of the most famous thought experiments in ethics, designed to challenge our moral intuitions about right and wrong. A runaway trolley is speeding down a track, and if nothing is done, it will kill 5 people who are tied to the rails. You are standing next to a lever that can switch the trolley onto another track, where only one person is tied down. The question is simple yet deeply unsettling. Do you pull the lever and actively cause one person's death to save 5, or do you do nothing and let the trolley continue on its path? On the surface, many argue that pulling the lever is the morally right choice. Sacrificing one to save 5 follows a utilitarian approach, which prioritizes the greatest good for the greatest number. But others argue that pulling the lever makes you directly responsible for the death of the one person, whereas doing nothing means you did not cause harm. You merely allowed it to happen. This aligns more with deontological ethics, which emphasizes the inherent morality of actions rather than their consequences. The problem becomes even more complex with variations. Suppose instead of a lever, you could stop the trolley by pushing a large person off a bridge onto the tracks, physically using them as a human barrier. Many people instinctively reject this, even though the math is the same, one life for 5. This suggests that our moral judgments are not purely logical, but shaped by deep-seated emotional and ethical principles. The trolley problem remains a vital ethical dilemma, especially in modern debates about self-driving cars, military decisions, and medical ethics. Determinism versus free will. The debate between determinism and free will is one of the oldest and most profound in philosophy, striking at the core of human existence. Determinism is the idea that every event, including human actions, is dictated by prior causes. If the universe operates like a vast chain of cause and effect, then everything we do is simply the result of previous conditions, our biology, environment, upbringing, and even the laws of physics. If determinism is true, then free will is an illusion. We may feel like we are making choices, but those choices were already set in motion long before we became aware of them. Free will, on the other hand, suggests that we have real agency over our decisions. The ability to choose between different options, to change our minds, and to act independently means that we are not simply products of fate. Many argue that, without free will, concepts like morality, responsibility, and justice lose meaning. If someone had no choice but to commit a crime, can they truly be blamed for it? A middle ground is compatibilism, the idea that determinism and free will can coexist. This perspective suggests that while our actions may be influenced by external factors, we still possess a meaningful level of choice. Even if certain factors shape our decisions, we are still the ones making them. Modern science complicates the debate. Neuroscience suggests that our brains make decisions before we are even conscious of them, hinting at determinism. Yet, on a human level, we continue to experience life as if we are making choices freely. The question remains, are we truly in control, or are we just following a script written by the universe? Existential angst. Existential angst is the deep, unsettling feeling of anxiety or dread that arises from confronting the reality of human existence. It's the moment when you realize that life has no predetermined meaning, that the universe is indifferent to your struggles, and that you alone are responsible for creating purpose in your life. This concept is central to existentialist philosophy, particularly in the works of thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger. Kierkegaard described it as the dizziness of freedom, the overwhelming realization that, unlike a stone or a tree, you are not bound by an inherent purpose. You must choose your own path, and with that freedom comes the terrifying responsibility of making the right choices. For Sartre, existential angst, or nausea, arises when we confront the absurdity of existence. Why are we here? Why does anything matter? We crave external validation, yet we are alone in our decisions. There is no cosmic blueprint guiding us, only the weight of our own choices. This realization can be paralyzing. Some try to escape it by clinging to religious dogma, societal expectations, or mindless distractions. But existentialists argue that the only true response is to embrace the freedom, to create meaning through authentic living, and to act with full ownership of one's existence. While existential angst can be unsettling, it is also liberating. It forces us to stop waiting for life to happen to us and instead actively shape it. Rather than seeing life's uncertainty as a curse, we can see it as an opportunity to define ourselves, to live with intention, and to make every moment count. Nihilism. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose. At its core, it rejects the idea that there is an objective moral order, a divine plan, or an ultimate truth governing existence. If nothing has intrinsic meaning, then everything, including morality, culture, and personal aspirations, is simply a human construct. This idea was famously explored by Friedrich Nietzsche, who proclaimed, "God is dead." He didn't mean this literally, but rather that traditional sources of meaning, religion, morality, and absolute truths were losing their power in the modern world. With this collapse, humanity faced a crisis. Without these structures, where do we find meaning? For Nietzsche, nihilism was dangerous, but also an opportunity. He warned against passive nihilism, where people sink into despair and meaninglessness. Instead, he called for active nihilism, a bold rejection of imposed values in favor of creating one's own purpose through strength and self-overcoming. Nihilism comes in many forms. Moral nihilism argues that concepts of right and wrong are subjective and arbitrary. Epistemological nihilism questions whether we can ever truly know anything. Existential nihilism, the most well-known form, claims that life itself lacks meaning. Critics of nihilism argue that it leads to despair, hedonism, or inaction. If nothing matters, why bother doing anything? But others see it as an opportunity for radical freedom. Without preordained purpose, we are free to define our own path, to live authentically, and to create our own values. Whether nihilism is a curse or a blank canvas for personal meaning depends entirely on how one chooses to respond to it. Solipsism. Solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is certain to exist. Everything else, people, objects, even the entire universe, could be an illusion, existing only within your consciousness. If you have ever wondered, what if I'm the only real person and everyone else is just a projection of my mind? You've stumbled upon solipsism. At its core, solipsism questions whether we can ever truly know that anything beyond our subjective experience is real. After all, everything you perceive, colors, sounds, sensations, exists only within your mind as neural signals. You've never experienced the world directly. You only experience your mind's interpretation of it. If this is the case, what proof is there that anything external exists at all? Philosophers like René Descartes wrestled with this dilemma. His famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was an attempt to ground certainty in at least one undeniable truth. The self that is thinking must exist. But beyond that, how do we prove the existence of anything else? Descartes ultimately invoked God as a guarantee that reality isn't a deception. Others, like George Berkeley, argued that existence is dependent on perception. Things exist because they are perceived, whether by us or by a higher being. Solipsism is an unsettling yet fascinating idea. If taken to the extreme, it could lead to an isolated and detached way of thinking. After all, if nothing else is real, why care about anything? However, most people reject solipsism in practical life, assuming that the external world exists, even if we can never prove it with absolute certainty. The problem of evil. The problem of evil is one of the most challenging questions in philosophy and theology. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God exists, why does evil exist? This dilemma has troubled thinkers for centuries. If God is omnipotent, all-powerful, he could eliminate evil. If he is omniscient, all-knowing, he would be aware of all suffering. If he is omnibenevolent, all good, he would want to prevent suffering. And yet, the world is full of pain, cruelty, and injustice. How can this be reconciled? There are several classic responses to this problem. One is the free will defense, which argues that God allows evil because true free will requires the possibility of choosing wrong. If humans were incapable of evil, they wouldn't truly be free. Another argument is soul-making theodicy, which suggests that suffering and hardship exist to help humans grow morally and spiritually. Without struggle, there would be no development of courage, compassion, or resilience. Some take a different approach and claim that human understanding is too limited to grasp divine justice. What appears as senseless suffering to us might serve a higher purpose beyond our comprehension. Others argue that evil is necessary as a contrast to good. Without darkness, would we appreciate light? Atheists and skeptics, however, argue that the sheer amount of suffering in the world, natural disasters, diseases, senseless violence, makes it unlikely that a benevolent God is in control. Some conclude that if a deity exists, it might not be omnipotent, omniscient, or perfectly good. The problem of evil remains a central challenge in philosophy of religion, raising fundamental questions about morality, human suffering, and the nature of the divine. Whether one sees it as an argument against God or as a test of faith depends on one's perspective. The paradox of the heap. The paradox of the heap, also known as the Sorites paradox, is a logical puzzle that challenges how we define vague concepts, particularly when gradual change leads to an unclear distinction between one state and another. Imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove one grain, it's still a heap. Remove another and another. Surely it's still a heap. But what happens when you continue this process? At what exact point does it stop being a heap and become just a small pile, or even just scattered grains? Conversely, if you start with a single grain of sand and add one at a time, when does it officially become a heap? This paradox applies to more than just sand. Consider baldness. If a man loses one hair, he's not bald, but if he keeps losing them, at some unclear point, we begin to call him bald. Likewise, when does a fetus become a child? When does an old car become junk? When does a child become an adult? The paradox of the heap highlights a fundamental issue in human language and reasoning. Many concepts we rely on daily, heap, rich, tall, bald, are not sharply defined. The vagueness of these definitions leads to paradoxical situations. Some philosophers, like those in the school of fuzzy logic, argue that truth is not always binary, true or false, but exists on a spectrum. Others propose that our language simply lacks the precision needed to resolve such paradoxes. At its core, this paradox forces us to question how we categorize the world. If we cannot pinpoint where a transition occurs, does that mean our definitions are flawed? Or does reality itself resist clear boundaries? Dualism versus monism. The debate between dualism and monism is one of the oldest and most fundamental in philosophy, concerning the nature of reality and the relationship between the mind and the physical world. Dualism is the belief that reality consists of two fundamentally different substances: the physical, body, brain, matter, and the non-physical, mind, consciousness, soul. René Descartes was one of the most famous dualists, arguing that the mind and body are separate but interact. He saw the mind as something immaterial, a thinking entity, while the body was simply a machine obeying physical laws. The problem, of course, is explaining how a non-physical mind could influence a physical body. If thoughts and decisions arise in an immaterial soul, how do they trigger neurons and bodily movement? Monism, on the other hand, holds that everything is made of just one fundamental substance. There are two main types of monism: materialism, physicalism. Everything, including thoughts and consciousness, arises from physical processes in the brain. According to this view, what we call mind is just brain activity, neurons firing, chemical reactions, and electrical signals. Idealism. Reality is entirely mental. Some philosophers, like George Berkeley, argued that the physical world only exists as perceptions in our minds. There is no external material reality, only consciousness and experiences. Both positions have deep implications. If dualism is true, then consciousness might exist beyond the body, opening the door to ideas like the afterlife or souls. But if monism is correct, then everything we experience, from emotions to thoughts, is reducible to physics and biology. This debate is still unresolved. Neuroscience increasingly supports a materialist view, showing how mental states correlate with brain activity. Yet, the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from physical processes, remains a major challenge. Whether we are more than just physical beings is a question that continues to shape philosophy, science, and even personal beliefs. Moral relativism. Moral relativism is the philosophical view that morality is not absolute, but is instead shaped by cultural, historical, or personal perspectives. In other words, what is considered right or wrong depends on context. There is no single, universal moral truth that applies to all people at all times. This idea challenges moral absolutism, which holds that certain ethical principles are unchanging and apply universally. For example, a moral absolutist might argue that murder is always wrong, regardless of culture or situation. A moral relativist, however, would argue that moral judgments depend on the circumstances. What one society considers immoral, another may see as acceptable or even virtuous. Cultural relativism suggests that morality is determined by societal norms. Practices like polygamy, the death penalty, or arranged marriage may be seen as acceptable in some cultures but unacceptable in others. Subjective relativism takes it even further, arguing that morality is up to each individual. What is right for one person may not be right for another. Historical relativism considers how moral values shift over time. For example, slavery was once widely accepted but is now universally condemned. Critics argue that moral relativism can lead to ethical nihilism, the belief that morality is meaningless. If no moral standard is better than another, does that mean we cannot condemn genocide or oppression? Some philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, argue that certain ethical principles must be universal to ensure justice and human dignity. Despite these criticisms, moral relativism remains an important perspective in discussions about tolerance, ethics, and the diversity of human beliefs. It forces us to question whether our moral convictions are truly objective or simply a product of our upbringing. Tabula rasa. Tabula rasa, Latin for blank slate, is the philosophical concept that individuals are born without inherent knowledge or mental content, and that all knowledge comes from experience and perception. This idea is most famously associated with John Locke, who argued that the human mind starts as a blank sheet and is shaped entirely by external influences such as education, culture, and environment. The idea of tabula rasa has profound implications. It suggests that human behavior is not predetermined by genetics, but is shaped by upbringing and experience. This perspective influenced modern psychology, particularly behaviorism, which argues that people can be conditioned to behave in certain ways based on external stimuli. It also underlies many ideas about education, emphasizing the role of learning and environment in shaping intelligence and character. However, modern science complicates this view. Research in genetics and neuroscience suggests that some aspects of personality, intelligence, and even morality may be innate. Infants show preferences, emotional responses, and basic problem-solving abilities long before they have had enough experience to learn them. This has led many to believe that human nature is a mix of nature and nurture. Some traits are inborn, while others are shaped by experience. Even so, tabula rasa remains a powerful metaphor for human potential. If we are shaped by experience, then education, culture, and personal choices have the power to transform us completely. Whether we start as a blank slate or not, our ability to learn and grow remains central to the human experience. The absurd. The absurd is the idea that human beings constantly search for meaning in a universe that is silent, indifferent, and ultimately devoid of inherent purpose. This concept, most famously explored by Albert Camus, describes the tension between our deep desire for understanding and the chaotic, unpredictable nature of existence. At the heart of the absurd is a contradiction. Humans crave order, reason, and meaning, but the universe offers none. We look for purpose in religion, philosophy, and personal ambitions, yet no universal answer presents itself. This realization can be deeply unsettling, leading some to despair or nihilism. Camus, however, rejected nihilism and argued that instead of seeking external meaning, we should embrace the absurd and live with full awareness of it. He used the myth of Sisyphus, a man condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, as a metaphor for human existence. Even though Sisyphus' task is pointless, Camus imagines him as happy because he accepts his fate and finds joy in the struggle itself. The absurd is not about hopelessness, but about liberation. It means we are free to create our own meaning instead of relying on imposed systems of belief. There is no cosmic script, no grand design controlling our fate. This can feel terrifying, but it also offers radical freedom. Instead of seeking answers that do not exist, we can live fully, embracing life's fleeting moments and shaping our own purpose in the face of meaninglessness. The eternal recurrence. The eternal recurrence is a thought experiment proposed by Friedrich Nietzsche, challenging us to consider how we live our lives and what it means to fully embrace existence. The idea suggests that you will have to relive your entire life, exactly as it happened over and over again for eternity. Every joy, every sorrow, every mistake, and every triumph, nothing would change, and there would be no escape. This idea forces a powerful question. If you had to relive your life infinitely, would you be able to say yes to it? Would you curse the idea, feeling trapped by regret and dissatisfaction? Or would you embrace it, living in such a way that you would gladly repeat your choices forever? Nietzsche saw this as the ultimate test of how much a person affirms their existence. If the thought of eternal recurrence horrifies you, it might mean you are not living in a way that is truly fulfilling or authentic. Rather than suggesting that the universe literally repeats itself, Nietzsche used eternal recurrence as a psychological and ethical challenge. It forces us to ask ourselves whether we are living a life we would be willing to experience endlessly. Instead of waiting for some future reward or fearing past mistakes, it demands that we embrace each moment fully. For Nietzsche, the ideal response to this challenge is the amor fati, the love of fate, to affirm life completely, to say yes to all experiences, even suffering, is the highest form of strength. Eternal recurrence is not about fear, but about responsibility. If life has no external meaning beyond what we give it, then we must live in such a way that we would joyfully repeat our existence forever. Social contract theory. Social contract theory is the idea that societies are formed through an implicit or explicit agreement between individuals and their governing institutions. It suggests that people give up some personal freedoms in exchange for security, order, and the benefits of living in a structured community. Without this agreement, life would be chaotic and governed only by brute force. This idea is central to political philosophy and has been explored by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hobbes believed that in a state of nature, a world without laws or government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this anarchy, people agree to obey a ruler or governing body, even if it means surrendering some of their freedoms. Locke, on the other hand, argued that the social contract exists to protect natural rights, such as life, liberty, and property. If a government fails to protect these rights, the people have a right to rebel. Rousseau took a different approach, believing that true legitimacy comes only when people collectively participate in shaping the laws they live under. At its core, Social contract theory is about the balance between individual freedom and societal order. It asks, how much control should a government have? What do we owe each other as members of a society? And when, if ever, is it justified to break the contract? This theory remains highly relevant in modern debates about justice, democracy, and human rights, as it underpins our understanding of law, governance, and citizenship. The Veil of Ignorance. The Veil of Ignorance is a thought experiment proposed by philosopher John Rawls to determine what a truly fair society would look like. It challenges us to design a just system without knowing where we personally would end up within it. Imagine that before you are born, you are behind a veil of ignorance that hides your future identity. You do not know whether you will be rich or poor, male or female, healthy or disabled, part of the majority or a marginalized group. Since you have no idea where you will land in society, you must create rules that are fair for everyone. Would you design a world where the rich have all the power and the poor suffer if there's a chance you might be born into poverty? Would you allow discrimination if you might end up in the group being discriminated against? Rawls argued that under these conditions, rational people would choose principles of justice that ensure fairness for all. They would prioritize basic freedoms, equal opportunities, and protections for the most vulnerable, since they might end up among them. This leads to what he calls justice as fairness, a system that does not favor any particular group, but instead seeks to create an equitable society. The veil of ignorance remains a powerful tool for thinking about ethics and policy. It forces us to step outside our personal biases and consider what is fair from a truly neutral perspective. It is widely used in discussions about economic inequality, healthcare, human rights, and social justice, offering a simple yet profound way to evaluate the fairness of any system. The is-ought problem. The is-ought problem, also known as Hume's guillotine, is a philosophical challenge introduced by David Hume, questioning whether moral or prescriptive statements, ought, can be logically derived from factual or descriptive statements, is. Hume observed that many arguments about morality and ethics attempt to derive what should be done based on observations of how things are. For example, someone might argue that because humans have historically lived in hierarchical societies, they ought to continue doing so. However, Hume pointed out that there is a fundamental gap between stating a fact about the world and prescribing a moral rule. Just because something is a certain way does not mean it should be that way. This problem has profound implications for ethics. If we cannot logically derive moral principles from facts alone, then where do our moral obligations come from? Are they purely subjective, or do they have an independent foundation? Some philosophers argue that reason alone cannot establish moral truths, while others attempt to bridge the gap through social contracts, human well-being, or religious doctrine. The is-ought problem forces us to examine our ethical reasoning carefully. It reminds us that just because something is natural or traditional does not automatically make it right. Many moral arguments require additional justification beyond simple observations about the world. This distinction remains a cornerstone of modern debates in ethics, law, and political philosophy, urging us to think critically about whether our moral conclusions are logically justified. Hedonism. Hedonism is the philosophical belief that pleasure is the highest good and the ultimate goal of human life. It argues that what is morally right or worthwhile is determined by what brings the most pleasure and the least pain. At its core, hedonism is based on the simple idea that happiness is the primary measure of a good life. Ancient Greek philosophers like Epicurus championed a refined form of hedonism, emphasizing not just fleeting physical pleasures, but long-term well-being and tranquility. Epicurean hedonism suggests that true pleasure comes from a balanced life, free from unnecessary desires, fears, and pain. This contrasts with crude or extreme hedonism, which seeks immediate gratification regardless of the consequences. In contrast, critics argue that a purely hedonistic lifestyle can be shallow or self-destructive. If pleasure is the only goal, does that mean we should avoid challenges, responsibilities, or sacrifices? Some philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, rejected hedonism entirely, arguing that morality should be based on duty and principles, not just pleasure. Others, like John Stuart Mill, refined hedonism into utilitarianism, suggesting that the best actions are those that maximize happiness for the greatest number of people rather than just the individual. Hedonism remains a powerful and controversial idea. It raises questions about what makes life meaningful and whether pleasure alone is a sufficient measure of fulfillment. While hedonism encourages us to seek joy and avoid suffering, it also forces us to consider whether a life devoted solely to pleasure is truly a life well lived. Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is a famous argument by the mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal that attempts to justify belief in God, not through evidence, but through a pragmatic cost-benefit analysis. Instead of asking whether God exists, Pascal asks, what do you stand to gain or lose by believing or not believing? He presents 4 possible outcomes. 1. If God exists and you believe, you gain infinite reward, heaven. 2. If God exists and you don't believe, you suffer infinite loss, hell. 3. If God doesn't exist and you believe, you lose nothing significant. 4. If God doesn't exist and you don't believe, you gain nothing significant. Since belief in God could result in infinite reward while disbelief risks infinite punishment, Pascal argues that the rational choice is to believe, even if the probability of God's existence is uncertain. The potential gain outweighs any possible loss. Critics challenge this argument in several ways. One objection is the many gods problem. Pascal assumes a specific kind of God, but what if another deity rewards disbelief instead? Others argue that belief should be based on truth, not self-interest, and that pretending to believe for a reward is not genuine faith. Some question whether belief can even be a choice. Can one force oneself to believe simply because it seems beneficial? Despite these criticisms, Pascal's wager remains an influential argument in philosophy of religion. It shifts the discussion from proving God's existence to considering the consequences of belief and doubt, making it a pragmatic rather than purely theological question. The cogito, I think, therefore I am. The cogito, famously stated by René Descartes as cogito, ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is one of the most foundational statements in philosophy. It serves as Descartes' ultimate proof of existence and the starting point for his method of doubt. Descartes set out to find absolute certainty by questioning everything he could possibly doubt. He realized that he could be deceived by his senses, misled by dreams, or even manipulated by an evil demon feeding him false perceptions. If everything he perceived could be an illusion, how could he know anything for sure? One thing, however, was undeniable. The very act of doubting meant there was something doing the doubting. Even if all external reality was an illusion, the experience of thinking was real. He concluded that even in the most extreme skepticism, one fact remained beyond doubt: his own existence as a thinking being. The cogito is significant because it establishes a foundation for knowledge. It asserts that self-awareness is the first undeniable truth. However, critics argue that it assumes too much. Some question whether the I in I think is justified. Perhaps thoughts exist, but does that necessarily mean there is a thinker? Others challenge whether Descartes truly proves existence beyond just the mental realm. Despite these debates, Cogito, ergo sum remains a powerful starting point for epistemology. It is a reminder that no matter how uncertain the world may seem, consciousness itself is the one thing we cannot doubt, the Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma is a philosophical problem raised by Socrates in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, which challenges the foundation of morality in relation to divine authority. The dilemma asks, is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? If something is good simply because the gods command it, then morality becomes arbitrary. The gods could declare murder or cruelty as morally good, and we would have no standard by which to challenge them. This suggests that morality is not based on any inherent truth, but merely on divine preference, which could, in theory, change at any time. On the other hand, if the gods command something because it is already good, then morality exists independently of divine authority. This means that even the gods must follow moral truths that exist beyond them. However, this raises another problem. If morality is independent of divine will, then we do not need gods to understand what is right and wrong. Morality would exist as a separate, objective system that humans can discover through reason. This dilemma remains a critical issue in philosophy of religion and ethics. It challenges the idea that morality comes solely from divine command, and instead suggests that moral reasoning must go beyond simply obeying authority. Some religious philosophers attempt to resolve the dilemma by arguing that God's nature itself is inherently good, meaning that his commands are neither arbitrary nor external. However, for many, the Euthyphro dilemma remains an open question that forces deeper reflection on the origins of morality. The golden mean. The golden mean is Aristotle's concept of virtue as the balance between extremes. Rather than seeing morality as rigid rules, Aristotle believed that ethical behavior lies in finding the right balance between excess and deficiency. For example, courage is a virtue, but too little courage, cowardice, is a flaw, just as too much courage, recklessness, is also harmful. Similarly, generosity is good, but being overly stingy is selfish, while being overly extravagant is wasteful. The key to ethical living, according to Aristotle, is developing practical wisdom, phronesis, to recognize where the balance lies in any given situation. The golden mean is not about mediocrity or always choosing the middle ground, but about achieving harmony and self-mastery. It recognizes that virtues are context-dependent and that people must cultivate good habits to make balanced decisions. A person who is naturally shy may need to push themselves toward boldness, while someone who is naturally aggressive may need to cultivate patience. This idea has profound implications beyond personal ethics. It applies to leadership, relationships, and even politics. Extremes often lead to instability, while a well-balanced approach fosters long-term success. The golden mean encourages individuals to develop character and self-awareness rather than blindly following rigid rules. Aristotle's ethical framework remains influential today, shaping modern discussions about virtue ethics. While other ethical systems focus on rules or consequences, the golden mean emphasizes moral growth and the cultivation of a well-rounded, virtuous life. Occam's razor. Occam's razor is a philosophical principle that states, the simplest explanation is usually the best one. It is a tool for logical reasoning that suggests that, when faced with multiple competing explanations, we should prefer the one that makes the fewest assumptions. This principle is named after the 14th century philosopher William of Ockham, who argued that unnecessary complexity should be avoided in reasoning. The idea is not that the simplest explanation is always correct, but that adding extra assumptions without evidence only increases the chances of error. For example, if you hear hoofbeats outside, it is more reasonable to assume they come from a horse rather than a zebra, unless you have specific reasons to believe otherwise. Occam's razor is widely applied in science, philosophy, and everyday decision-making. In science, it helps formulate theories with the fewest assumptions, ensuring they are testable and not needlessly complicated. For instance, if two scientific models explain a phenomenon equally well, the one with fewer speculative elements is generally preferred. In medicine, it guides diagnoses. Doctors typically look for common illnesses before considering rare or exotic conditions. However, critics caution that simplicity alone does not guarantee truth. Sometimes reality is complex, and the simplest explanation may overlook crucial details. Occam's razor is best used as a heuristic, a guiding principle rather than an absolute rule. It reminds us to be skeptical of unnecessary complications and to prioritize clarity and evidence over speculation. The principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything that exists must have a reason or explanation for why it is the way it is and not otherwise. This principle, closely associated with the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, asserts that nothing happens without a cause, reason, or sufficient explanation, even if we do not yet know what that reason is. This idea is foundational in both metaphysics and science. In physics, for example, we assume that events have causes, even if those causes are hidden or difficult to uncover. The principle also plays a role in logic and mathematics, where each statement or conclusion must be justified. Philosophically, the principle of sufficient reason leads to profound questions about existence itself. Why does the universe exist rather than nothing? Why are the laws of nature the way they are? Leibniz used this principle to argue for the existence of God, claiming that the universe must have a necessary reason for its existence, something beyond the physical world itself. Others have applied it to debates about determinism, arguing that if everything has a reason, then free will may be an illusion, since every action would ultimately be determined by prior causes. Despite its intuitive appeal, the principle has been challenged. Some argue that not everything needs a reason. Perhaps some events, like quantum fluctuations, happen randomly without a clear cause. Others suggest that seeking explanations for everything might lead to an infinite regress, where every reason itself demands another reason. Whether fully accepted or not, the principle of sufficient reason remains a powerful idea that underpins how we seek to understand the world. It drives scientific inquiry, philosophical debate, and our natural human instinct to ask, why? The Gettier problem. The Gettier problem is a philosophical challenge to the traditional definition of knowledge, showing that a person can have a justified true belief without actually having knowledge. This problem, introduced by Edmund Gettier in 1963, shook the foundations of epistemology and forced philosophers to rethink what it means to know something. For centuries, knowledge was commonly defined as justified true belief, JTB. According to this definition, if you believe something, have good reasons to support it, and it happens to be true, then you know it. However, Gettier demonstrated that this definition is incomplete by presenting cases where someone has a belief that is both justified and true, but still does not seem like knowledge. Consider an example. Suppose you have a friend, Sarah, who owns a red car. One day you see her driving a red car, so you conclude Sarah owns a red car. However, unknown to you, Sarah actually sold her car the day before, and the car you saw her driving was a rental. Coincidentally, though, Sarah did buy another red car earlier that morning. Your belief is true, and you had justification for it. But was it really knowledge? It seems more like a lucky guess that happened to be correct. Gettier-style problems reveal that mere justification and truth are not enough for knowledge. There must be something more, perhaps an absence of luck, stronger evidence, or a different way of justifying beliefs. The Gettier problem remains an open question in philosophy, prompting new theories about what separates real knowledge from mere coincidence. The categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is Immanuel Kant's central principle of morality, stating that ethical actions must be universal and based on duty rather than consequences. Unlike utilitarianism, which judges actions by their outcomes, Kantian ethics argues that morality is about following absolute rules that apply to everyone, regardless of circumstances. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in different ways, but the most famous version is, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In simpler terms, before taking any action, ask yourself, what if everyone did this? If the action would lead to a contradictory or undesirable world, then it is morally wrong. For example, suppose you are tempted to lie to get out of trouble. Applying the categorical imperative, you must ask, what if everyone lied when it was convenient? If lying became universal, trust would collapse and communication would become meaningless. Since this would create a self-defeating world, lying is immoral. Another key formulation of the categorical imperative is, treat humanity, whether in yourself or in others, always as an end, never merely as a means. This means that people should never be used as tools for selfish purposes, exploiting others for personal gain, manipulating people, or treating them as disposable violates their dignity as rational beings. Kant's ethics emphasize duty, respect, and moral consistency, while some criticize it for being too rigid, since it does not allow exceptions based on circumstances. It remains one of the most influential moral theories. The categorical imperative challenges us to act with integrity and to ensure that our moral principles could hold for all people at all times. The mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is one of the oldest and most fundamental questions in philosophy. What is the relationship between the mind and the body? Are they separate substances, or is the mind just a function of the brain? How do thoughts, emotions, and consciousness arise from physical matter? This problem was most famously explored by René Descartes, who argued for dualism, the idea that the mind and body are two distinct substances. According to Descartes, the body is physical, governed by the laws of nature, while the mind or soul is immaterial, capable of thought and self-awareness. The challenge for dualism is explaining how these two substances interact. If the mind is non-physical, how does it influence the body? How does a thought like, I want to raise my hand, result in physical movement? In contrast, monism argues that mind and body are not separate. Materialism, physicalism, the dominant scientific view today, claims that everything, including thoughts and emotions, can be explained by brain activity. According to this view, consciousness arises from neurons firing in complex patterns, and the mind is simply what the brain does. However, this leads to the hard problem of consciousness. Why do certain brain processes give rise to subjective experience? A computer processes information, but it does not feel anything. Why does the human brain create the sensation of being alive? Other theories attempt to bridge the gap. Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, present even in the smallest particles. Functionalism compares the mind to a software program running on the brain's hardware, meaning consciousness could, in theory, exist in artificial intelligence. The mind-body problem remains unsolved. Whether consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity, a fundamental aspect of reality, or something beyond our understanding, it continues to challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. Akrasia, weakness of will. Akrasia is the ancient Greek term for acting against one's better judgment, knowing what is right but failing to do it. It is the internal struggle between reason and impulse, where people make choices they themselves recognize as bad. Plato and Aristotle both explored akrasia, questioning why rational beings sometimes fail to follow reason. Suppose you decide to eat healthy, yet late at night you binge on junk food. You knew it was a bad choice, but you did it anyway. Why? This problem goes beyond diet. It applies to procrastination, addiction, destructive relationships, and any situation where people act contrary to their best interests. Socrates believed that true knowledge prevents akrasia. If someone really understands that something is bad, they would not do it. He argued that ignorance, not weakness of will, is the cause of bad decisions. Aristotle disagreed, arguing that people can know what is best, but still be swayed by emotions and desires. He saw akrasia as a failure of self-control rather than ignorance. Modern psychology supports Aristotle's view. Studies in cognitive bias, habit formation, and self-discipline show that willpower is limited and easily undermined by stress, temptation, or fatigue. The brain often prioritizes short-term pleasure over long-term well-being. Understanding akrasia is key to improving self-discipline. Strategies like habit building, delayed gratification, and mindfulness can help overcome it. Whether in philosophy or daily life, akrasia remains a central challenge. Knowing what is right is one thing, but consistently doing it is another. Dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is the philosophical framework developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to explain how history, society, and economic structures evolve through conflict and material conditions. It is rooted in two key ideas: dialectics, the process of change through contradictions, and materialism, the belief that material conditions, such as economy, labor, and production, shape human society rather than ideas or spiritual forces. At its core, dialectical materialism argues that history progresses through class struggle. Marx saw society as driven by contradictions between opposing economic classes, for example, between feudal lords and peasants, or between capitalists and workers. These conflicts create tensions that ultimately lead to revolutionary change. In capitalism, the contradiction lies in how wealth is produced by workers but controlled by the owners. Marx predicted that this would lead to inevitable struggle and the eventual rise of a classless communist society. Unlike traditional idealist philosophies, which see history as shaped by ideas, dialectical materialism insists that material forces, who controls the means of production, how goods are distributed, and how labor is organized, determine societal development. In other words, economics drives history. The dominant ideology of any era, whether religion, law, or morality, is not an independent force, but a reflection of the ruling class's interests. Dialectical materialism remains influential in political theory, economics, and sociology. While some argue that Marx underestimated human agency and cultural factors, his framework continues to shape debates on inequality, labor rights, and the nature of historical progress. Whether one agrees or disagrees with Marx's thought, dialectical materialism provides a powerful lens through which to analyze power, change, and economic structures in human history. The experience machine. The experience machine is a thought experiment proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick to challenge hedonism, the idea that pleasure is the highest good. It asks a simple but unsettling question. If you could plug into a machine that creates perfect, pleasurable experiences, would you do it? Imagine a machine that could simulate any life you desire. You could experience fame, love, adventure, or pure happiness, all indistinguishable from real life. While plugged in, you would not know it was fake. No suffering, no disappointments, just endless joy. Given that hedonism suggests pleasure is the ultimate goal, wouldn't the rational choice be to stay plugged in forever? Nozick argues that most people would reject the machine, proving that we value more than just pleasure. We want reality, even if it is imperfect. People care about being connected to truth, having genuine achievements, and living authentic lives, not just experiencing an illusion of happiness. This suggests that meaning, autonomy, and personal growth are more important than mere pleasure. The experience machine raises deep questions about human nature. It forces us to ask, what makes life worth living? If we could live in a simulated paradise, would it be any less meaningful? This thought experiment remains highly relevant today, especially with advancements in virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and debates about simulated worlds. Nozick's conclusion challenges us to think beyond pleasure and consider what truly makes a fulfilling life. Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that states that the best action is the one that maximizes overall happiness and minimizes suffering. It is a form of consequentialism, meaning that actions are judged based on their outcomes rather than intentions or inherent morality. The core idea is summed up in the principle of the greatest good for the greatest number. This philosophy was developed by Jeremy Bentham and later refined by John Stuart Mill. Bentham introduced the concept of the hedonic calculus, a method of measuring pleasure and pain to determine the morality of an action. He argued that all pleasures and pains could be weighed objectively, and the action that produced the most pleasure should be chosen. Mill, however, recognized that not all pleasures are equal. Some, such as intellectual or moral pleasures, are higher and more valuable than basic physical pleasures. Utilitarianism is often praised for its practicality. It provides a clear way to evaluate difficult moral dilemmas, such as medical ethics, e.g., distributing limited resources to save the most lives, or policymaking, e.g., making laws that benefit the majority. However, it also faces serious criticisms. One major problem is the tyranny of the majority. If maximizing happiness means harming a small group, does that justify the harm? For example, if punishing an innocent person brings peace to a society, would that be moral? Another criticism is that utilitarianism ignores individual rights. Under strict utilitarian logic, sacrificing one person to save 5 would be justified, but many people find this intuitively wrong. Despite these challenges, utilitarianism remains one of the most influential moral theories in philosophy, economics, and politics. It forces us to think about how our actions affect others and whether our moral choices truly maximize well-being. Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno's paradoxes are a set of philosophical puzzles that challenge our understanding of motion, space, and infinity. Proposed by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea, these paradoxes argue that motion and change, as we perceive them, might be illusions. One of the most famous is Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine a race where Achilles, the fastest runner, gives a slow-moving tortoise a head start. By the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved a little farther. When Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise has moved again. This continues infinitely, meaning Achilles can never truly catch the tortoise. But in reality, we know he will. So where is the flaw in our reasoning? Another paradox is the dichotomy paradox, which states that before reaching a destination, you must first reach the halfway point. Before reaching that halfway point, you must reach a quarter of the way. Since this sequence continues infinitely, it seems that motion should be impossible. Yet we move all the time. Zeno used these paradoxes to support Parmenides' idea that change and motion are illusions. However, modern mathematics and physics explain these puzzles using the concept of limits in calculus. While there are infinitely many steps, they can sum to a finite distance, resolving the apparent contradiction. Even though math has provided solutions, Zeno's paradoxes continue to spark debates about the nature of time, space, and infinity. They challenge our intuition and force us to question whether reality is as straightforward as it seems. The anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is the idea that the universe appears fine-tuned for human life, because if it weren't, we wouldn't be here to observe it. In other words, the very fact that we exist places restrictions on the kinds of universes that can exist. This principle comes in two main forms. The weak anthropic principle, WAP, states that our observations of the universe are biased because we can only exist in a universe that allows life. If the fundamental physical constants, such as gravity, the speed of light, or nuclear forces, were even slightly different, life as we know it would not be possible. The universe looks finely tuned, but that's only because we're observing it from the only possible perspective, one where life exists. The strong anthropic principle, SAP, goes further, suggesting that the universe must be structured in such a way that conscious life inevitably arises. Some interpretations even suggest that intelligence is a fundamental feature of the cosmos, or that multiple universes exist, each with different physical laws, and we just happen to be in one that supports life. Critics argue that the anthropic principle is more of a philosophical observation than a scientific explanation. It doesn't tell us why the universe has these specific conditions, only that we couldn't observe any other kind. Some see it as a weak excuse to avoid deeper questions about the origins of the universe, while others view it as a key insight into cosmology, quantum mechanics, and the potential existence of a multiverse. Regardless, it raises profound questions about whether the universe is uniquely structured for life, or whether we are just one lucky accident among countless other possibilities. The liar paradox. The liar paradox is a self-referential statement that leads to a logical contradiction, most famously expressed as, "This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it must be false, as it claims. But if it's false, then it must be true, because it correctly states that it is false." The result is a loop with no clear resolution, revealing a deep problem in logic and language. Variations of the liar paradox have puzzled philosophers for centuries. Consider a person saying, "Everything I say is false." If that statement is true, then everything they say, including that statement, is false, creating a contradiction. Similarly, if a sign reads, "Ignore this sign," should you follow its instructions or ignore them? This paradox challenges the foundations of logic, mathematics, and language. It was a significant issue for Bertrand Russell, who encountered similar contradictions while developing set theory. It also influenced Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any formal system of logic, there will always be statements that are true but unprovable. Possible solutions include rejecting self-referential statements as meaningless, creating new logical categories to handle paradoxes, or acknowledging that truth may not always be binary, true or false, but may exist on a spectrum. The liar paradox remains an essential problem in philosophy, forcing us to rethink the limits of language, logic, and meaning itself. The problem of induction. The problem of induction is a fundamental challenge in epistemology, first clearly articulated by David Hume. It questions whether we can justify our reliance on past experiences to predict the future. In simple terms, just because something has happened repeatedly in the past, does that mean it will continue to happen in the future? Hume pointed out that much of human reasoning is based on inductive inference, drawing general conclusions from specific observations. For example, we assume the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every day before. But how do we know this? We don't have absolute proof, only past experience. Hume argued that this reasoning is circular. We assume that the future will resemble the past because it has always done so, but that assumption itself is based on past experience, which is what we are trying to justify in the first place. This problem undermines the certainty of all empirical knowledge. Science, for example, relies heavily on induction, forming general laws based on repeated experiments. But if induction itself has no logical foundation, does that mean all scientific conclusions are uncertain? Philosophers have proposed solutions, such as pragmatism, arguing that induction works well in practice, so we should use it anyway, or probabilistic reasoning, suggesting that while induction isn't logically certain, it is highly likely to be reliable. However, the problem of induction remains unresolved, reminding us that much of what we know about the world is based not on certainty, but on habit and expectation. Falsificationism. Falsificationism is a scientific philosophy proposed by Karl Popper as a response to the problem of induction. Instead of trying to prove theories true through repeated observations, Popper argued that scientific progress depends on our ability to prove theories false. According to falsificationism, a scientific theory is only meaningful if it can be tested and potentially proven wrong. For example, if a theory states, all swans are white, then observing thousands of white swans does not prove the theory, but finding a single black swan does disprove it. This is why Popper rejected verificationism, the idea that science should focus on confirming theories, in favor of falsifiability as the true standard of science. Falsificationism separates science from pseudoscience. A good scientific theory makes bold predictions that could, in principle, be tested and refuted. By contrast, pseudosciences like astrology or Freudian psychology often explain away counterexamples rather than accepting that their theories could be wrong. If a theory can accommodate any possible observation, it is not scientific because it is not falsifiable. However, falsificationism has its own challenges. In real science, theories are rarely discarded after one failed experiment. Scientists often revise or refine them. Additionally, some fields, like quantum mechanics or cosmology, deal with entities that cannot always be directly tested. Despite these issues, falsification remains one of the most important principles in the philosophy of science, shaping how we distinguish real scientific inquiry from speculation and unfounded belief. The butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is the idea that small changes in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes in complex systems. It comes from chaos theory and was popularized by meteorologist Edward Lorenz, who discovered that tiny variations in atmospheric conditions could drastically alter weather predictions. The name comes from the poetic idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could, through a chain of small, unpredictable changes, set off a tornado in Texas. This principle challenges our intuitive belief that small causes produce small effects. In reality, many systems, weather patterns, ecosystems, economies, even human lives, are highly sensitive to small inputs. A minor decision, like choosing one job over another, might set off a sequence of events that alters your entire life. The butterfly effect also has philosophical implications, particularly regarding free will and determinism. If the future is shaped by countless small factors beyond our control, can we ever truly predict or control our destiny? It also raises questions about responsibility. If small actions can lead to massive consequences, how much control do we really have over outcomes? While the butterfly effect emphasizes unpredictability, it does not mean events are random. Instead, it highlights that even deterministic systems, where outcomes follow laws of nature, can be so complex that they seem chaotic. This concept is widely used in physics, economics, psychology, and storytelling, suggesting that even the smallest actions might carry unimaginable significance. the Sorites paradox. The Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, challenges our understanding of vague concepts and gradual change. It asks, how many grains of sand make a heap? Imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove one grain, it is still a heap. If you remove another, it remains a heap. But if you continue this process, at some point, you are left with only a few grains. When did it stop being a heap? Conversely, if you start with one grain and add more, at what exact point does it become a heap? This paradox exposes the problem of vagueness in language. Many concepts, baldness, wealth, tallness, have no clear boundary. If a person loses hair gradually, when do they become bald? If you save a little money at a time, when do you become rich? These concepts rely on arbitrary thresholds rather than precise definitions. Philosophers have proposed several solutions. Fuzzy logic suggests that truth is not binary, true or false, but exists on a spectrum. Others argue that while the boundaries are unclear, we can still use approximate reasoning in everyday life. Some reject the paradox entirely, claiming that language is naturally imprecise and trying to force absolute definitions onto vague concepts is a mistake. The Sorites paradox is more than a linguistic puzzle. It has real-world implications. It applies to law. When does a minor crime become serious? Ethics. When does a lie become unacceptable? And identity. How much change can a person undergo and still be the same person? The paradox forces us to confront the limits of human reasoning and challenges us to think more carefully about how we define the world around us. The lottery paradox. The lottery paradox is a philosophical puzzle that exposes contradictions in how we justify beliefs, particularly in situations involving probability. It was introduced by Henry Kaiberg and challenges our understanding of rational belief and certainty. Consider a fair lottery with 10,000 tickets and only one winning ticket. It is rational to believe that any single ticket will lose because the probability of losing, 9,999 out of 10,000, is extremely high. If this reasoning applies to every ticket, then we must also believe that all tickets will lose. However, this contradicts the fact that one ticket must win. How can we rationally believe that every ticket will lose while knowing that one of them must win? This paradox highlights the tension between rationality and probability. We intuitively think that if something is very improbable, we are justified in believing it won't happen. But when this logic is applied universally, it leads to contradiction. It raises key questions in epistemology. Should rational belief be based purely on probability? Can we ever be justified in believing something that is not certain? One proposed solution is to redefine what it means to believe something in probabilistic terms. Some argue that beliefs should be seen as degrees of confidence rather than absolute truths, meaning we should not fully believe that any single ticket will lose, only that it is extremely likely. The lottery paradox continues to be an important problem in discussions of logic, probability, and the nature of rational belief. Buridan's ass. Buridan's ass is a paradox about free will, decision-making, and rationality, named after the 14th century philosopher Jean Buridan. It illustrates a situation where pure rationality leads to inaction. Imagine a donkey standing exactly between two identical piles of hay. The donkey, being perfectly rational, has no reason to prefer one pile over the other. Since both options are equally desirable, it cannot make a rational decision. As a result, it starves to death, unable to choose. This paradox highlights a problem in deterministic decision-making. If every choice is based solely on reason and external factors, then in cases where all factors are equal, decision-making becomes impossible. It raises the question, Is rationality enough for making decisions, or do we need some form of spontaneity, randomness, or free will? Buridan's ass is relevant in philosophy, psychology, and artificial intelligence. It applies to human decision-making when people get stuck between two equal choices, such as picking between two equally appealing job offers. It also raises concerns for AI. If an algorithm is purely rational, how would it resolve a conflict between two equal choices? One possible solution is breaking the tie with an arbitrary choice, suggesting that randomness, intuition, or external influence plays a necessary role in decision-making. While the paradox is a playful thought experiment, it has deep implications for free will, determinism, and the limits of logical reasoning in real-life decisions. Metaethics. Metaethics is the branch of philosophy that examines the nature, origin, and meaning of moral concepts. Unlike normative ethics, which asks what actions are right or wrong, metaethics explores what morality itself is. It asks fundamental questions like, are moral values objective or subjective? Do moral statements express facts or just opinions? Can we truly know what is right and wrong? One major debate in metaethics is between moral realism and moral anti-realism. Moral realists argue that moral truths exist independently of human beliefs, just as mathematical truths do. For example, murder is objectively wrong, regardless of cultural or personal views. In contrast, moral anti-realists claim that morality is constructed by humans and has no objective existence outside of our perceptions. According to this view, moral rules are more like social agreements than universal truths. Another key debate is between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Cognitivists believe that moral statements, e.g., stealing is wrong, express factual claims that can be true or false. Non-cognitivists, however, argue that moral statements are more like expressions of emotion or commands. When someone says, stealing is wrong, they are not stating a fact, but expressing disapproval or discouraging theft. Metaethics also examines how we justify moral beliefs. Are moral values based on reason, emotions, or societal conventions? Some philosophers argue that morality is grounded in rational principles, while others believe it emerges from evolutionary and psychological factors. The study of metaethics is crucial because it influences how we approach ethical dilemmas. If morality is objective, then moral debates can have definitive answers. But if morality is subjective, ethical disagreements may never be fully resolvable. By questioning the foundations of moral reasoning, metaethics forces us to think deeply about what it really means to be good or bad. The argument from illusion. The argument from illusion is a philosophical problem that challenges the reliability of our senses by pointing out that perception is not always accurate. It suggests that if we sometimes experience illusions or hallucinations, then how can we ever be certain that our senses are telling us the truth? For example, when a stick is half submerged in water, it appears bent, even though it is actually straight. A distant object might look smaller than it really is, and a mirage might make us see water where there is none. If our senses deceive us in these cases, how do we know they are not deceiving us all the time? This leads to a deeper question. Do we perceive reality as it truly is, or do we only experience distorted representations of it? This argument has been used by skeptics to question the possibility of absolute knowledge. René Descartes famously used a similar argument in his Meditations, suggesting that if our senses can mislead us, we should doubt all sensory-based knowledge. He extended this skepticism with the idea of an evil demon, a hypothetical being that could be deceiving us into believing a completely false reality. In response, indirect realists argue that we do not perceive the external world directly, but rather through mental representations of it. Idealists, like George Berkeley, go even further, claiming that reality itself is nothing more than perceptions in the mind. the argument from illusion remains relevant in modern philosophy and cognitive science, as it ties into discussions about virtual reality, simulation theory, and the nature of consciousness. It raises the unsettling possibility that what we take as reality might just be an elaborate illusion shaped by the limitations of our perception. The open question argument. The open question argument, proposed by G. E. Moore in his 1903 book Principia Ethica, is a powerful critique of ethical naturalism, the idea that moral properties, such as good or right, can be defined in terms of natural properties, such as pleasure, survival, or evolutionary benefit. Moore argued that moral concepts cannot be reduced to empirical or scientific facts because moral questions always remain open to further inquiry. His reasoning is simple. Suppose someone claims that good is the same as pleasure. We can then ask, is pleasure really good? If this question makes sense, then good and pleasure cannot be identical, because if two terms are truly synonymous, questioning their equivalence would be meaningless. For example, asking, is a bachelor an unmarried man, feels trivial because the definitions are identical. But asking, is pleasure good, remains a legitimate and open question, meaning good cannot simply be defined as pleasure. This argument, now known as Moore's paradox, suggests that moral terms refer to something beyond physical or psychological facts. Moore believed that goodness is a simple, indefinable property, something we recognize intuitively but cannot reduce to scientific explanations. The open question argument has had a lasting impact on ethics, pushing philosophers away from defining morality in purely naturalistic or scientific terms. It challenges any attempt to equate moral values with biology, psychology, or economics, suggesting that morality operates in a distinct and irreducible domain. However, critics argue that language evolves, and just because a question seems open does not mean it has no objective answer. The debate over whether morality is independent of natural facts continues to shape modern philosophy. The death of the author. The death of the author is a radical literary theory introduced by Roland Barthes in his 1967 essay of the same name. It challenges the idea that an author's intentions, biography, or personal meaning are the key to understanding a text. Instead, Barthes argues that once a work is created, the author's influence over its interpretation dies, leaving meaning entirely in the hands of the reader. Traditionally, literary criticism sought to uncover an author's intended meaning by analyzing their life, historical context, or psychological state. Barthes rejected this approach, claiming that focusing on the author's intent limits the richness of interpretation. Instead, he argued that texts do not have a single, fixed meaning. Rather, meaning emerges through the interaction between the reader and the words on the page. In this view, literature is not about discovering what the author meant, but about exploring what the text does for the reader. Barthes' theory has profound implications for literature, art, and even philosophy. It suggests that works are independent entities open to infinite interpretations, and that trying to find a single, authoritative meaning is misguided. This idea influenced postmodernism, deconstruction, and reader response theory, all of which emphasize the subjective experience of meaning rather than the creator's original intent. However, the death of the author is controversial. Critics argue that dismissing the author entirely ignores the historical and cultural context that shapes a work. Some also point out that many authors deliberately encode specific meanings into their texts. While Barthes' idea is extreme, it raises an important question. Should we judge a work by what the author intended or by what it means to us? Whether one agrees with Barthes or not, his argument remains one of the most influential challenges to traditional literary interpretation, reshaping how we think about meaning, authorship, and the role of the reader in understanding texts. The identity of indiscernibles. The identity of indiscernibles is a principle in metaphysics proposed by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, stating that if two entities share all their properties, then they must be the same entity. In other words, if there is no way to distinguish between two objects, even in theory, then they are not truly separate, but are one and the same. Leibniz formulated this principle as a response to philosophical debates about identity and difference. If two things are truly distinct, there must be at least one characteristic that sets them apart. If no such difference exists, then they are identical. This principle is sometimes summed up as, no two things can be exactly alike in all respects and still be distinct. This idea has deep implications in logic, metaphysics, and even physics. In classical philosophy, it suggests that individuality is based on unique properties rather than mere existence. In quantum mechanics, however, the principle is challenged by particles like electrons, which appear to be completely identical and indistinguishable. Some interpretations suggest that at a fundamental level, identity may not work the way we intuitively think it does. A related concept is Leibniz's law, which states that if two things are identical, then whatever is true of one must be true of the other. This forms the basis of many logical and philosophical arguments about identity, especially in discussions of personal identity, time, and the nature of objects. The identity of indiscernibles forces us to ask, what truly makes something unique? Is identity based on intrinsic properties, or do we impose distinctions through perception and language? These questions remain central to contemporary philosophy, particularly in debates about the nature of reality and individuality. The hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers to describe the deepest and most perplexing question in philosophy of mind. Why and how does physical brain activity give rise to subjective experience? While neuroscience has made great progress in understanding the mechanisms of the brain, how neurons fire, how perception works, and how memories are stored, this is often referred to as the easy problems of consciousness. The hard problem, however, goes beyond function and asks, why do we experience things at all? Why does seeing red feel like something? Why does pain hurt rather than just being a neutral signal processed in the brain? This issue is particularly troubling for materialism, the idea that everything, including the mind, is purely physical. If the brain is just a biological machine, why does it generate an internal, subjective reality? Could a sufficiently advanced robot, built with circuits instead of neurons, ever experience consciousness the way humans do? Or would it just behave as if it were conscious without truly feeling anything? Some theories attempt to explain consciousness through emergent properties, suggesting that when a system reaches a certain level of complexity, consciousness naturally arises. Others, such as panpsychism, argue that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present even in the smallest particles. Despite decades of research, the hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved. It raises profound questions about free will, artificial intelligence, and the nature of reality itself. If we cannot explain why we experience the world the way we do, we may still be far from understanding what it truly means to be human. The Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis is the idea that the Earth and its biological systems function as a single, self-regulating organism that maintains conditions favorable for life. Proposed by James Lovelock in the 1970s, the hypothesis suggests that life itself plays an active role in stabilizing the environment, such as regulating temperature atmospheric composition, and ocean salinity, ensuring that Earth remains habitable over long periods. Lovelock's theory challenges the traditional view that life simply adapts to the environment. Instead, he argues that life actively shapes its surroundings. For example, Earth's atmosphere contains a much higher concentration of oxygen than expected from geological processes alone. This is due to photosynthetic organisms, which continuously produce oxygen, maintaining a stable balance that supports life. Similarly, ocean salinity has remained within narrow limits for hundreds of millions of years, despite the fact that natural erosion should have made the oceans too salty for life. Lovelock suggests that biological processes help regulate these levels. While the Gaia hypothesis is sometimes misunderstood as implying that Earth is conscious or alive, Lovelock clarified that it is not about mystical beliefs, but about complex systems and feedback loops. However, the hypothesis has been controversial. Critics argue that evolution operates on individual organisms, not entire planets, and that life doesn't intentionally regulate the environment. Even so, some aspects of Gaia theory have been incorporated into modern Earth system science, climate studies, and discussions on how human activity disrupts natural balance. The Gaia hypothesis forces us to rethink our relationship with the planet, not as passive inhabitants, but as part of an interconnected system where life and environment continuously shape each other. Whether fully accepted or not, it has influenced discussions on climate change, sustainability, and the fragile balance that allows Earth to remain a living world. The free rider problem. The free rider problem is a classic issue in economics, ethics, and political philosophy that occurs when individuals benefit from a shared resource or service without contributing to its cost or maintenance. It highlights the challenge of collective action. How do we ensure that everyone plays their part in supporting public goods when people have an incentive to let others carry the burden? A common example is public transportation. If a city funds buses through taxes rather than fares, some people may avoid paying taxes but still use the buses. Similarly, in a workplace team project, some members may put in less effort, knowing that others will complete the work. In national defense, all citizens benefit from security, whether or not they actively support or fund the military. The key issue is that when too many people try to free ride, the system collapses. If no one pays for public transport, it cannot function. The free rider problem is closely related to the tragedy of the commons, where individuals overuse a shared resource, such as overfishing in the ocean, because they assume others will manage it responsibly. It also connects to game theory, particularly the prisoner's dilemma, where individuals acting in self-interest can lead to worse outcomes for everyone. Solutions to the free rider problem include taxation, laws, and incentives. Governments impose taxes to fund public goods, while organizations use rewards or penalties to encourage participation. Some societies rely on social norms, such as peer pressure or moral responsibility, to ensure cooperation. The free rider problem remains a major challenge in issues like climate change. Why should one country cut emissions if others won't? And voting. Why should I vote if my single vote doesn't decide the election? Understanding this problem helps explain why collective action is difficult, and why human cooperation often requires more than just rational self-interest. The simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis proposes that reality as we know it may be a highly advanced computer simulation rather than a fundamental physical reality. Philosopher Nick Bostrom popularized this idea by arguing that if technological civilizations progress far enough, they could create realistic simulated worlds that include conscious beings unaware that they are part of a simulation. Bostrom's argument is based on probability. He suggests that at least one of three possibilities must be true. Either civilizations never reached the stage of creating advanced simulations due to self-destruction or technological limitations. Civilizations reach that stage but choose not to run simulations, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation. If a civilization were capable of creating realistic simulated beings, it would likely create many such simulations, possibly billions. If this were the case, the number of simulated beings would vastly outnumber real ones, meaning that statistically we are more likely to be simulated than real. The simulation hypothesis raises deep questions about free will, consciousness, and the nature of reality. If we are in a simulation, the question arises whether we could ever break out. Would the simulator be a godlike entity? Could entire universes be simulated within other simulations, creating an infinite chain of realities? Critics argue that the hypothesis is unfalsifiable, meaning it cannot be proven or disproven, making it scientifically meaningless. Others suggest that even if we are simulated, it makes no practical difference since the simulation would still follow consistent rules, which we perceive as physics. Regardless of its validity, the simulation hypothesis forces us to rethink our fundamental understanding of existence. If we were in a simulation, how would we even know? And if we discovered the truth, would it change anything? Skepticism. Skepticism is the philosophical position that doubts the certainty of knowledge, questioning whether we can truly know anything with absolute confidence. It challenges assumptions about reality, perception, and belief, pushing us to reconsider how we acquire knowledge and whether our perceptions can be trusted. One of the earliest skeptics, Pyrrho of Elis, argued that humans should suspend judgment on all matters, as certainty is unattainable. Later, René Descartes introduced radical skepticism, doubting even the existence of the external world. He proposed the thought experiment of an evil demon deceiving us into believing in a false reality. His only unshakable truth was, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, as even doubting itself proved the existence of a conscious thinker. Skepticism manifests in multiple ways. Empirical skepticism questions whether our senses provide reliable information, given that illusions and hallucinations can mislead us. Moral skepticism challenges the notion of objective moral truths, suggesting morality may be a human construct rather than an absolute standard. Religious skepticism critically examines claims about gods, miracles, and supernatural events, often demanding empirical evidence before accepting such beliefs. Skepticism plays a vital role in science, philosophy, and daily reasoning, encouraging the demand for evidence, logical consistency, and critical thinking. However, extreme skepticism can lead to solipsism, the belief that only one's own mind is certain to exist, making meaningful engagement with reality difficult. Philosophers such as David Hume advocated for moderate skepticism, arguing that while certainty is impossible, we can still form rational beliefs based on probability and experience. This balance between doubt and pragmatism allows for questioning assumptions while still engaging with reality. Skepticism remains central in modern debates about misinformation, scientific theories, and conspiracy beliefs, reminding us that questioning is valuable, but also that at some point we must act on reasonable evidence even if absolute certainty remains unattainable. Eternalism versus presentism. The debate between eternalism and presentism concerns the nature of time and existence. Eternalism holds that all moments, past, present, and future, exist equally, while presentism argues that only the present moment is real, with the past being gone and the future not yet existing. Eternalism is often compared to a block universe, where time is like a fourth dimension, similar to space. Just as different locations exist simultaneously, all points in time exist at once, even if we only experience one at a time. This view aligns with Einstein's theory of relativity, which suggests that time is not absolute, but relative to the observer. If all moments exist, then concepts like fate and determinism gain significance, as the future is already out there, in some sense. Presentism, in contrast, argues that only the present moment is real. The past no longer exists, and the future is yet to be determined. This aligns more with common sense. Events fade into memory, and the future remains unknown. Critics argue that presentism struggles to explain time's flow in a scientifically rigorous way. This debate remains unresolved, raising fundamental questions about free will, destiny, and whether time is something we move through or an illusion of perception. The ontological argument. The ontological argument is a philosophical argument for God's existence based on logic and reason rather than empirical evidence. First formulated by Anselm of Canterbury, it claims that the very concept of God implies his necessary existence. Anselm defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. If God exists only as an idea in the mind, but not in reality, then a greater being, one that exists both in thought and in reality, can be conceived. Since God is defined as the greatest possible being, he must exist in reality as well as in thought. Otherwise, he would not be truly the greatest. This argument was later refined by philosophers such as René Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz. Descartes claimed that just as the concept of a triangle necessarily includes three sides, the concept of God necessarily includes existence. Leibniz attempted to strengthen the argument by clarifying that God's existence must be logically possible, making it necessary. Critics, including Immanuel Kant, rejected the argument, claiming that existence is not a property that can be attributed like omniscience or perfection. Just because we can define something a certain way does not mean it exists. Bertrand Russell and other philosophers have also argued that the ontological argument relies too much on wordplay rather than real-world evidence. Despite its controversies, the argument remains one of the most debated proofs of God's existence, forcing philosophers to consider whether logic alone can establish reality. The Mereological paradox. The Mereological paradox arises from the philosophical study of mereology, which examines how parts relate to wholes. It questions whether objects are truly distinct from their components or whether they are merely a collection of their parts. This paradox challenges our basic assumptions about identity, composition, and what it means for something to exist as a whole rather than just as a sum of its parts. One famous mereological puzzle is the ship of Theseus. If all the parts of a ship are gradually replaced, is it still the same ship? If the old parts are reassembled into another ship, which one is the real ship of Theseus? Mereology forces us to ask whether objects retain their identity through change or whether they become entirely new entities. Another issue is mereological nihilism, the radical view that composite objects do not truly exist, only the smallest indivisible parts do. According to this view, things like tables and people are just convenient labels for collections of particles rather than real entities. The mereological paradox highlights deep problems in ontology and identity. If objects are just their parts, then what makes a whole more than just a collection? And if objects are more than their parts, what defines their unity? These questions remain central to modern metaphysics. Quietism. Quietism is a philosophical stance that suggests many philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings of language or thought, and that the best response is to stop engaging in such debates altogether. Instead of seeking ultimate answers, Quietism encourages a detached, almost passive approach to philosophical inquiry, arguing that many disputes are meaningless or unresolvable. Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most famous quietists, believed that philosophical problems often stem from misusing language. In his later work, he argued that instead of trying to solve deep metaphysical or epistemological questions, we should recognize that they emerge from confusion about how language functions. For example, debates about whether free will or the self exist might dissolve if we simply recognize that different contexts give these terms different meanings. Quietism also appears in ethical and religious traditions, such as Taoism and certain Buddhist schools, where the emphasis is on inner peace, non-attachment, and avoiding unnecessary intellectual struggle. Rather than searching for ultimate truths, quietists accept the limits of human knowledge and focus on how we live and communicate. Critics argue that quietism is overly passive, avoiding rather than resolving important issues. However, its defenders claim that many philosophical problems only seem deep because they are phrased in misleading ways. Whether a path to wisdom or an escape from difficult questions, quietism remains an influential response to philosophy's grandest puzzles. The paradox of choice. The paradox of choice is the idea that while having choices is generally seen as a good thing, too many choices can lead to anxiety, indecision, and dissatisfaction. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this concept, arguing that an overabundance of options can actually make people less happy rather than more free. In a world with limitless choices, whether in careers, relationships, consumer goods, or life decisions, people often feel overwhelmed. Instead of feeling liberated, they experience decision paralysis, where they struggle to make a choice at all. Even when they do decide, they may suffer from regret or FOMO, fear of missing out, worrying that they made the wrong decision and could have chosen something better. Schwartz distinguishes between two types of decision makers: maximizers and satisficers. Maximizers try to find the absolute best option, comparing every possibility and often feeling dissatisfied. Satisficers, on the other hand, settle for good enough and tend to be happier. This suggests that learning to accept good enough can be psychologically healthier than always striving for the perfect choice. The paradox of choice has implications for economics, mental health, and everyday decision-making. It raises an important question. Is more freedom always better, or does simplicity lead to greater happiness? Sometimes fewer choices may actually mean a more fulfilling life. The Copernican Principle. The Copernican Principle is the idea that humans do not occupy a privileged or special position in the universe. Named after Nicolaus Copernicus, who demonstrated that the Earth orbits the Sun rather than being the center of the cosmos, this principle suggests that our place in the universe is likely unremarkable. Historically, people believed that Earth was the center of everything. Copernicus's model shattered this assumption, showing that the Earth is just one planet among many. This idea has been extended to modern cosmology, implying that our solar system, galaxy, and even our observable universe are not uniquely special, but rather part of a vast, indifferent cosmos. The principle has profound implications. In astronomy, it suggests that if life emerged on Earth, it is likely to exist elsewhere. In philosophy, it challenges human exceptionalism and raises questions about our significance. It also supports the mediocrity principle, which states that Earth and humanity are probably average rather than unique. However, the Copernican principle also has limits. Some argue that Earth does seem unusual in its ability to support complex life, suggesting that our position may not be entirely random. Still, this principle continues to shape scientific thought, reminding us that the universe is vast, and we may not be as central to it as we once believed. Socratic irony. Socratic irony is a rhetorical technique used by Socrates in which he pretends to be ignorant or humble in order to expose contradictions in someone else's beliefs. It is a form of feigned ignorance that forces an opponent to critically examine their own ideas, often leading them to realize they do not understand what they thought they did. Socrates would engage in dialogue by asking seemingly innocent questions, pretending not to know the answer. His opponents, believing themselves wise, would confidently explain their views. However, through further questioning, Socrates would reveal contradictions or flaws in their reasoning. The person would eventually reach a point where they had no choice but to admit their ignorance. Hence, Socrates' famous claim, "I know that I know nothing." This technique is central to the Socratic method, a teaching style that encourages critical thinking through persistent questioning. It remains a foundation of philosophical inquiry, law, and education. Socratic irony can be seen as both a teaching tool and a subtle form of intellectual trap. While it encourages self-reflection, it can also frustrate opponents, making them feel humiliated rather than enlightened. Despite this, it remains one of the most powerful methods of revealing the limits of knowledge. The naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is a logical mistake in ethical reasoning where people assume that what is natural is automatically good or right. The term was introduced by G.E. Moore in his book Principia Ethica, where he argued that one cannot define moral values purely based on natural properties like pleasure, survival, or evolutionary success. This fallacy is often expressed in arguments like, because humans evolved to eat meat, eating meat is morally right, or because aggression exists in nature, it must be acceptable. However, just because something occurs naturally does not mean it is ethically justified. Diseases, suffering, and violence are also natural, yet we do not consider them good. The fallacy highlights a key distinction between descriptive statements, what is, and prescriptive statements, what ought to be. Just because something happens in nature does not mean it should happen in society. Ethics requires additional reasoning beyond what is simply natural. This fallacy remains relevant in debates on morality, politics, and science. It reminds us that nature is not necessarily a moral guide, and ethical principles must be evaluated on their own merits, not just on what appears natural. The evil demon hypothesis. The evil demon hypothesis is a radical skepticism thought experiment introduced by René Descartes to question the reliability of human perception and knowledge. Descartes proposed the idea that a powerful, malevolent being, an evil demon, could be deceiving us, making us believe in a false reality. In this scenario, everything we perceive, our senses, our memories, even our logical reasoning, could be manipulated by this deceptive entity. If such a demon existed, how could we ever be certain that anything we believe is true? This hypothesis serves as a foundation for Descartes' method of hyperbolic doubt, where he systematically doubts everything in search of absolute certainty. The only thing that survives this extreme skepticism is cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if the demon is deceiving Descartes, there must still be a thinking entity being deceived. This realization provides the first unshakable foundation for knowledge. The evil demon hypothesis remains influential in discussions of skepticism, consciousness, and artificial reality. It has inspired modern variations, such as the brain in a vat thought experiment and the simulation hypothesis, both of which challenge our ability to verify reality beyond our subjective experience. Hume's guillotine. Hume's guillotine, also known as the is-ought problem, is a principle introduced by David Hume that argues that one cannot logically derive moral or prescriptive statements, what ought to be, from purely factual or descriptive statements, what is. This challenges the idea that ethical truths can be based directly on natural facts. Hume observed that many philosophers move from statements about how the world is to conclusions about how the world should be without providing logical justification. For example, someone might argue, people have always engaged in warfare, therefore war is natural and should not be avoided. Hume points out that this reasoning is flawed because there is a logical gap between describing what happens and prescribing what should happen. This principle has had a profound impact on ethics and moral philosophy. It suggests that moral values cannot be directly deduced from nature or science alone. There must be an additional ethical framework or reasoning involved. Hume's guillotine forces us to critically examine moral claims and consider whether they are based on sound reasoning or simply assumed to follow from observations. Modern debates in ethics, law, and political philosophy continue to grapple with this issue. It serves as a warning against making moral arguments based solely on tradition, biology, or social norms, reminding us that morality requires more than just appealing to what already exists. The No True Scotsman Fallacy. The No True Scotsman Fallacy is a logical fallacy where someone redefines a category in an ad hoc way to exclude counterexamples that disprove their claim. It is a form of circular reasoning, often used to protect a belief from criticism by shifting the definition rather than addressing the argument. The term comes from an example where someone claims, "No Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge." When presented with a counterexample, "But my friend Angus is a Scotsman, and he puts sugar on his porridge," the person responds, "Well, no true Scotsman does that." Instead of admitting their statement was incorrect, they redefined Scotsman to exclude the counterexample. This fallacy is common in ideological debates. Someone might say, "No real gamer plays mobile games," or "No true patriot criticizes their country." When evidence is presented, they modify the definition to exclude the example rather than reevaluating their claim. The No True Scotsman Fallacy highlights the problem of definitional manipulation. Instead of engaging with opposing evidence, it dismisses it outright. Recognizing this fallacy helps in identifying intellectually dishonest arguments where shifting goalposts are used to avoid admitting mistakes. Moore's Paradox. Moore's paradox, introduced by G.E. Moore, describes a contradiction that arises when someone makes a statement like, "It is raining, but I don't believe it is raining." This sentence is not logically contradictory. It is possible for it to rain while someone does not believe it, but it is epistemically absurd because believing it requires holding two conflicting attitudes at the same time. This paradox raises fundamental questions about belief, self-awareness, and rationality. Normally, if we assert something, we also believe it to be true. If someone says, "I am in pain, but I don't believe I am in pain," we recognize that something has gone wrong, not with the logic, but with the coherence of their belief system. Moore's paradox has been explored in philosophy of mind, language, and self-knowledge. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to believe something? If belief involves an internal commitment to truth, then making contradictory statements about belief seems irrational. This paradox also appears in psychology and cognitive science, where people sometimes hold contradictory thoughts due to cognitive dissonance. Moore's insight helps us understand why self-awareness and belief are closely linked, making it one of the more intriguing puzzles in philosophy of language and thought. The Paradox of Tolerance. The paradox of tolerance, introduced by Karl Popper, states that if a society is tolerant without limits, it will eventually be destroyed by the intolerant. In other words, unlimited tolerance can lead to the end of tolerance itself. Popper argued that while societies should be open and accepting of different viewpoints, they must not tolerate intolerance to the extent that it allows oppressive ideologies to take over. If intolerant groups are given free rein to spread hatred, violence, or anti-democratic values, they will eventually dismantle the very freedoms that allowed them to exist. Thus, to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to deny tolerance to the intolerant when they threaten the rights and safety of others. This paradox raises difficult questions about freedom of speech, democracy, and the limits of tolerance. Should societies allow hate speech or extremist ideologies in the name of free expression, even if they seek to destroy that very freedom? Where do we draw the line between protecting diversity of thought and preventing harmful movements from taking root? The paradox of tolerance remains relevant in modern debates about censorship, hate speech laws, and the rise of authoritarianism. It reminds us that absolute tolerance can be self-defeating and that some level of restriction may be necessary to preserve an open society. Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox, discovered by Bertrand Russell in 1901, is a fundamental problem in set theory that exposes contradictions in the way we define collections. It specifically challenges the idea that a set can contain itself as a member. Russell asked, "Does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? If it does contain itself, then by definition, it should not contain itself. But if it does not contain itself, then it must belong in the set, which means it does contain itself." This contradiction reveals a deep flaw in early mathematical logic. To understand the paradox, imagine a barber in a town who shaves everyone who does not shave themselves. The question arises, does the barber shave himself? If he does, he shouldn't, because he only shaves those who don't shave themselves. But if he doesn't, then he must, because he shaves everyone who doesn't shave themselves. This self-referential loop mirrors Russell's paradox in set theory. This paradox led to the development of modern logic and mathematical foundations, including Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which avoids self-referential sets. It also has broader implications for logic, philosophy, and computing, influencing areas such as Gödel's incompleteness theorems and discussions on self-reference in artificial intelligence. Russell's paradox remains one of the most famous paradoxes in mathematics and philosophy, illustrating the dangers of self-reference and the necessity of carefully defining logical systems. The paradox of omnipotence. The paradox of omnipotence questions whether an all-powerful being can create a task that it cannot complete. The most famous version asks, can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the being can create such a rock, then there is something it cannot do. Lift it, meaning it is not truly omnipotent. But if it cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something it cannot do, challenging the concept of unlimited power. This paradox raises deep issues about the nature of omnipotence, logic, and the limits of power. Some theologians and philosophers, such as Thomas Aquinas, argue that omnipotence should be understood as the ability to do all things that are logically possible, meaning contradictions like creating a square circle are not included in the definition of omnipotence. Others, like C.S. Lewis, suggest that God's power does not extend to self-contradictions because they are not real things but meaningless statements. The paradox of omnipotence remains a central challenge in theology and philosophy of religion, particularly in discussions about whether an all-powerful being can exist without logical contradictions. It forces us to reconsider whether omnipotence means the power to do anything or only to do what is logically possible. The prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is a fundamental problem in game theory and decision-making that demonstrates how rational individuals might act against their own best interests when they cannot trust each other. It is typically framed as a scenario in which two criminals are arrested and placed in separate interrogation rooms. Each is given the same offer. If one betrays the other while the other remains silent, the betrayer goes free while the silent prisoner receives the maximum sentence. If both betray each other, they both receive a moderate sentence. If both remain silent, they each receive a minimal sentence. From a purely rational perspective, each prisoner should betray the other, because betrayal offers the best individual outcome regardless of what the other person does. However, if both betray each other, they end up worse off than if they had cooperated by staying silent. This dilemma shows how individual rationality can lead to collective failure. The prisoner's dilemma has implications in economics, politics, and psychology, particularly in issues of trust, cooperation, and competition. It explains why businesses engage in destructive price wars, why nations struggle to disarm, and why individuals sometimes act selfishly even when cooperation would benefit everyone. The dilemma highlights the difficulty of achieving mutual trust in uncertain situations. It also suggests that cooperation can emerge when people expect to interact repeatedly, as long-term trust changes the incentives toward working together rather than acting selfishly. The lottery fallacy. The lottery fallacy occurs when people assume that because an event is highly improbable, it cannot or should not happen. This fallacy often arises in discussions about probability, luck, and rare occurrences, leading to flawed reasoning about randomness and likelihood. A classic example is when someone wins the lottery, and skeptics claim the event must have been rigged because the odds were astronomically low. However, this reasoning is mistaken. While the chance of any one specific person winning is extremely small, the chance that someone will win is quite high, given the large number of participants. The fallacy occurs when people misinterpret improbable events as impossible, or when they assume that an unlikely event happening must have some extraordinary explanation. This fallacy is commonly found in conspiracy theories, where people reject coincidences or unlikely events as too improbable to be natural. It also appears in arguments about evolution, where critics may claim that complex life is too unlikely to have emerged randomly, ignoring the vast timescales and number of possible mutations involved. Understanding the lottery fallacy helps in distinguishing between genuine improbability and statistical inevitability. While rare events are individually unlikely, in a large enough system, even the most improbable occurrences become expected over time. The problem of the criterion. The problem of the criterion, introduced by philosopher Roderick Chisholm, is a fundamental dilemma in epistemology that questions how we can distinguish true knowledge from falsehood. It presents a circular problem. To determine whether a belief is justified, we need a reliable method for evaluating knowledge. However, to establish that our method is reliable, we first need to identify which beliefs are true. This creates a paradox. How can we define knowledge without already knowing what knowledge is? This problem appears in everyday reasoning. If someone asks, "How do you know this claim is true?" the response might be, "Because of this reliable method." But if they then ask, "How do you know that method is reliable?" we must appeal to another justification, which itself needs validation. Eventually, the argument risks falling into either an infinite regress, endlessly requiring new justifications, or circular reasoning, assuming what we are trying to prove. There are two main responses to this problem. Methodists argue that we should start by establishing a clear method for determining truth before deciding what we can know. Particularists, on the other hand, argue that we already know some things and should build our criteria for knowledge based on those examples. The problem of the criterion remains one of the deepest challenges in philosophy. It forces us to examine whether certainty is ever possible and whether our attempts to justify knowledge are doomed to either circularity or infinite skepticism. Hume's problem of miracles. Hume's problem of miracles is a skeptical argument questioning whether we can ever be justified in believing that a miracle has occurred. In his book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, David Hume defines a miracle as a violation of natural laws, something that contradicts our regular experience of how the world works. His argument suggests that believing in miracles requires an unreasonable level of evidence. Hume's reasoning is based on probability, since natural laws are confirmed by countless observations. Fire burns, people do not rise from the dead, and objects fall when dropped. It is far more likely that reports of miracles are mistaken than that the natural laws have actually been broken. Given the choice between accepting a highly improbable event or assuming error, deception, or exaggeration, the rational conclusion is usually skepticism. He also notes that reports of miracles often come from unreliable sources, including religious zealots or ancient texts. Human psychology is prone to bias, wishful thinking, and exaggeration, making miraculous claims even more suspect. Hume's problem of miracles remains central in discussions on religion, epistemology, and the philosophy of science. While some argue that miracles should not be dismissed outright, Hume's challenge forces us to critically evaluate extraordinary claims before accepting them as truth. The infinite regress problem. The infinite regress problem occurs when an argument, explanation, or justification requires an endless chain of reasoning, making it impossible to reach a solid foundation. This problem appears in epistemology, metaphysics, and logic, wherever a claim requires further justification that itself demands another justification, and so on indefinitely. One example in epistemology is the question, how do you know X is true? If the answer is because of Y, and then we ask, how do you know Y is true? The chain continues infinitely unless a stopping point is found. Without a final justification, knowledge would be impossible to establish. In metaphysics, the first cause problem illustrates this dilemma. If everything must have a cause, then each cause must itself have a cause, leading to an infinite regress. Some propose that an uncaused first cause, such as God or the Big Bang, is necessary to avoid this endless chain. There are three common responses to the infinite regress problem. Foundationalism argues that some basic beliefs or principles are self-evident and require no further justification. Coherentism suggests that beliefs can justify each other in a web-like structure rather than a linear chain. Infinitism, the least popular view, accepts that justification can continue infinitely without needing an ultimate foundation. The infinite regress problem highlights fundamental challenges in rational justification, causality, and the nature of explanation. Whether in philosophy, science, or logic, it raises the question, where does justification ultimately stop? The Raven Paradox. The Raven Paradox, formulated by Carl Gustav Hempel, is a logical puzzle in the philosophy of science that challenges how we confirm general statements through observation. It arises from the problem of inductive reasoning, how we justify broad scientific laws based on specific observations. Hempel starts with the general statement, all ravens are black. This means that any time we observe a black raven, we gain confirming evidence for the statement. However, by the principle of contraposition in logic, this statement is equivalent to all non-black things are not ravens. If this is true, then every time we observe a non-black object that is not a raven, a red apple, a blue car, or a white shirt, we also confirm the original statement. This leads to the paradoxical conclusion that seeing a green tree provides evidence that all ravens are black. The paradox challenges our intuition about scientific reasoning. While logically valid, the idea that looking at objects unrelated to ravens can confirm a statement about ravens feels absurd. Some responses suggest that not all evidence should be weighted equally, or that relevance matters in scientific confirmation. The Raven Paradox remains an important problem in confirmation theory, forcing us to reconsider What counts as valid evidence in scientific inquiry? Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias in which people with low ability in a certain area tend to overestimate their competence, while highly skilled individuals tend to underestimate theirs. This psychological phenomenon was identified by David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who found that people with limited knowledge often lack the self-awareness needed to recognize their own shortcomings. At the core of the effect is the idea that ignorance breeds overconfidence. Incompetent individuals do not realize how little they know and thus assume they are more capable than they actually are. Conversely, experts often underestimate their abilities because they are more aware of the complexities involved and assume that others understand just as much as they do. This creates an ironic effect. Those who know the least often think they know the most, while those who are truly knowledgeable tend to doubt themselves. This bias has widespread implications in education, politics, business, and decision-making. It explains why unqualified individuals sometimes assume leadership roles with unwarranted confidence, why conspiracy theorists believe they have deep insights that experts lack, and why students may believe they understand material better than they actually do. Overcoming the Dunning-Kruger effect requires self-awareness, humility, and continuous learning. Recognizing our own limitations is key to avoiding poor decision-making and fostering real intellectual growth. The effect serves as a reminder that true wisdom lies in understanding how much we do not know. The Munchausen trilemma. The Munchausen trilemma is a philosophical problem that reveals the difficulty of providing absolute justification for any belief or claim. Named after Baron Munchausen, who supposedly pulled himself out of a swamp by his own hair, the trilemma suggests that any attempt to justify knowledge inevitably leads to one of three unsatisfactory outcomes: infinite regress, circular reasoning, or axiomatic assumptions. The first option, infinite regress, means that every justification requires another justification, leading to an endless chain with no final foundation. If we ask, why is X true, and answer with, because of Y, then we must ask, why is Y true, and so on forever. The second option, circular reasoning, occurs when a claim is justified by itself in some way. For example, defining a word by using the word itself, or saying, my reasoning is reliable because I reasoned that it is. The third option, axiomatic assumptions, involves accepting some basic belief or principle without justification, treating it as self-evident or beyond questioning. The Munchausen trilemma challenges the idea that knowledge can ever be fully justified in a foundational way. It forces philosophers to consider whether we must simply accept some starting points without proof, or whether alternative methods, such as coherentism, where beliefs support each other in a web-like structure, can provide a solution. This trilemma remains central in epistemology, reminding us that certainty in knowledge may always be an illusion. Mereological nihilism. Mereological nihilism is the radical metaphysical view that composite objects, things made up of parts, do not truly exist. According to this perspective, only fundamental particles or simples exist, while what we call objects are just convenient ways of talking about groupings of these basic elements. For example, a table does not exist in a strict sense. What we call a table is just a collection of atoms arranged in a particular way. Mereological nihilists argue that wholes do not exist, only parts do. This means that everyday objects, from chairs to planets to human beings, are just illusions of language rather than real, independent entities. This view challenges common sense ontology, the belief that objects exist as distinct entities. It also presents difficulties for concepts like personal identity. If a person is just a collection of particles, can we truly say I exist as a unified self? Some philosophers propose a compromise called mereological universalism, which argues that any collection of objects can be considered a whole, meaning that a person and a random pile of rocks are equally valid things. Mereological nihilism remains controversial because it contradicts everyday experience while raising profound questions about the nature of existence. If everything is reducible to its smallest parts, does anything beyond those parts truly exist? This debate continues in metaphysics and philosophy of language, challenging how we define reality itself. The tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons describes a situation where individuals acting in their own self-interest deplete a shared resource, ultimately harming everyone, including themselves. This concept, popularized by Garrett Hardin in 1968, illustrates how collective resources, such as land, water, air, or fisheries, can be overused when individuals fail to regulate their consumption. Imagine a group of farmers sharing a communal pasture. If each farmer adds more animals to graze, they personally benefit from increased production. However, if everyone follows this logic, the pasture becomes overgrazed and eventually destroyed, leaving no resources for anyone. This same principle applies to environmental issues like climate change, overfishing, deforestation, and air pollution. Each person or company may believe their individual contribution to the problem is small, but when multiplied across an entire population, the effects become catastrophic. Solutions to the tragedy of the commons include government regulation, privatization, and community-based management. Some argue that state intervention is necessary to protect resources, while others suggest that local communities, when given clear ownership and responsibility, can sustainably manage shared resources. The paradox highlights the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility, reminding us that without cooperation or regulation, shared resources will inevitably be depleted. Panpsychism. Panpsychism is the philosophical view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe and is present, in some form, in all things, even inanimate objects like rocks, atoms, or entire galaxies. Unlike materialism, which holds that consciousness arises only from complex brain activity, panpsychism suggests that mind-like qualities exist at all levels of reality, not just in humans or animals. This idea has ancient roots in Eastern philosophy, Stoicism, and Spinoza's metaphysics, but it has gained renewed attention in modern debates about consciousness. Traditional neuroscience struggles to explain how subjective experience emerges from purely physical processes, a mystery known as the hard problem of consciousness. Panpsychism provides a radical solution by proposing that consciousness does not need to be produced at all, but instead exists everywhere in different degrees. There are various versions of panpsychism. Micropsychism suggests that fundamental particles, like electrons, have primitive forms of consciousness, which combine to create human experience. Cosmopsychism, on the other hand, argues that the entire universe is a single, unified conscious entity. Critics argue that panpsychism is unscientific or meaningless since it does not explain how small conscious entities combine into the unified experience of a human mind. Others see it as a compelling alternative to the limitations of materialist explanations. Panpsychism challenges the conventional divide between mind and matter, suggesting that consciousness may be as fundamental as space, time, and energy. If true, this view could radically reshape our understanding of reality, intelligence, and even the nature of life itself. Terror management theory. Terror management theory, TMT, is a psychological and philosophical framework that explains how humans cope with the awareness of their own mortality. Developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski, TMT argues that much of human behavior, our beliefs, values, and cultural systems arises from a deep need to manage the existential terror of death. Unlike animals, humans have the unique ability to anticipate their own demise. This awareness creates existential anxiety, which we alleviate through symbolic immortality, the idea that we can live on through religion, culture, accomplishments, or societal contributions. Many belief systems, including religion and nationalism, provide people with a sense of belonging and purpose, helping them cope with the inevitability of death. Experiments in TMT have shown that when people are reminded of death, they become more defensive of their cultural values, more likely to conform to societal norms, and more hostile toward outsiders. This suggests that fear of death influences human behavior in profound ways, shaping politics, morality, and even self-esteem. The theory has important implications for understanding why people cling to ideologies, why conflict arises between groups, and how humans construct meaning in an indifferent universe. Whether through religion, legacy, or achievement, TMT suggests that much of what we do is an unconscious attempt to transcend our own mortality. Quantum superposition and philosophy. Quantum superposition is one of the strangest concepts in physics, but it also has deep philosophical implications about reality, observation, and consciousness. According to quantum mechanics, a particle, like an electron, does not exist in just one state, but in multiple possible states at once until it is measured. This idea is famously illustrated by Schrödinger's cat, a thought experiment where a cat in a box is both alive and dead until it is observed. This concept raises troubling questions about the nature of reality. If observation determines an outcome, then does reality exist independently of observation? Some interpretations, like the Copenhagen interpretation, suggest that reality remains undefined until an observer measures it. Others, like the many worlds interpretation, propose that all possible outcomes actually happen in separate parallel universes, meaning there is a universe where the cat lives and another where it dies. Philosophers and scientists have debated whether quantum mechanics implies that consciousness plays a role in shaping reality. If measurement collapses superposition, does that mean the act of observation itself creates reality? This idea has led to connections with idealism, panpsychism, and even simulation theories. Quantum superposition challenges determinism, objectivity, and materialism, forcing us to reconsider whether reality is fixed or fundamentally shaped by observation. If reality is not absolute, but instead a set of probabilities, then the world may be far stranger than we ever imagined. Egoism versus altruism. The debate between egoism and altruism revolves around whether human behavior is fundamentally self-interested or genuinely motivated by concern for others. Egoism holds that people act primarily out of self-interest, whether consciously or unconsciously. Altruism, on the other hand, suggests that people are capable of acting for the benefit of others, even at personal cost. Psychological egoism, defended by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, argues that all human actions, no matter how selfless they appear, are ultimately driven by self-benefit. Even acts of kindness, such as donating to charity or saving a stranger, are said to arise from hidden motives like personal satisfaction, social approval, or long-term gain. Ethical egoism, a related but distinct position, suggests that people should act in their own self-interest, because doing so ultimately benefits society. Altruism challenges this view by asserting that genuine selflessness is possible. Thinkers like David Hume and Peter Singer argue that humans have natural empathy and can act purely for the sake of others. Evolutionary biology also suggests that altruistic behavior, such as helping relatives or members of a social group, increases the survival of genes, making it an adaptive trait. The tension between egoism and altruism raises fundamental moral questions. Are humans naturally selfish? Is helping others ever truly selfless? And should we prioritize our own well-being or the greater good? This debate influences ethics, psychology, and even economics, shaping how we understand human motivation and moral responsibility. The Chinese Room Argument. The Chinese Room Argument, proposed by John Searle, is a thought experiment that challenges the idea that artificial intelligence, AI, can truly understand or have consciousness. It is designed as a critique of strong AI, which claims that a computer can have a mind and genuinely comprehend language. Searle asks us to imagine a person inside a closed room who does not understand Chinese. They receive Chinese symbols as input and follow a rulebook, written in English, that tells them how to manipulate and return the correct Chinese symbols as output. From the outside, it appears that the person understands Chinese, but in reality, they are merely following syntactic rules without any true comprehension. Searle argues that this is exactly how AI functions. It processes symbols, follows rules, and produces responses, but it does not actually understand meaning. Computers, no matter how sophisticated, only manipulate symbols syntactically, based on structure, rather than semantically, based on meaning. Therefore, even if a machine passes the Turing test by convincingly simulating human conversation, it does not mean it possesses real consciousness or understanding. Critics of the argument, such as Daniel Dennett, argue that the human brain itself is just a complex system processing information, much like a computer, and that understanding could emerge from complex computations. Others propose that AI could achieve consciousness through deeper forms of machine learning or neural networks. The Chinese Room Argument remains a key discussion point in philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science, raising the question, can machines ever truly think, or are they just advanced symbol manipulators? Compatibilism. Compatibilism is the philosophical view that free will and determinism can coexist. While determinism suggests that all events, including human actions, are caused by prior events and natural laws, compatibilists argue that this does not eliminate human freedom. Instead, they redefine free will as acting according to one's desires and reasoning without external coercion. Philosophers like David Hume and Daniel Dennett support compatibilism, arguing that free will does not require absolute independence from causality, but simply the ability to act in alignment with one's internal motivations. Under this view, a person making a choice is still free as long as their decision reflects their own beliefs and desires, even if those desires were shaped by prior causes. Critics argue that if our choices are determined by factors beyond our control, then they are not truly free. The debate between compatibilists and incompatibilists remains central to discussions on moral responsibility, law, and human agency. Logical positivism. Logical positivism is a philosophical movement that asserts that only statements that can be empirically verified or logically proven have meaning. Originating from the Vienna Circle in the early 20th century, thinkers like A.J. Ayer and Rudolf Carnap argued that statements about metaphysics, ethics, and theology are meaningless unless they can be tested through observation or mathematical proof. This approach is based on the verification principle, which holds that a statement is meaningful only if it is either analytically true, true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried, or empirically verifiable, proven through observation, like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Claims about the supernatural, morality, or subjective experiences are dismissed as nonsensical or unscientific. Logical positivism dominated early analytic philosophy, but faced criticism for being self-refuting, since the verification principle itself cannot be empirically tested. Despite its decline, it shaped modern philosophy of science and continues to influence debates on knowledge, truth, and scientific reasoning. The ontological shock. Ontological shock occurs when a person encounters information that radically challenges their understanding of reality, forcing them to rethink fundamental beliefs. This experience can arise from scientific discoveries, philosophical revelations, or personal transformations that disrupt one's worldview. Examples of ontological shock include learning that Earth is not the center of the universe, realizing the vast implications of quantum mechanics, or confronting the idea that free will may not exist. Encounters with artificial intelligence, alien life, or near-death experiences also provoke deep existential crises, leading individuals to question the nature of existence, consciousness, and meaning. Philosophers and psychologists see ontological shock as both disorienting and transformative. While it can lead to existential dread, it can also foster intellectual growth, resilience, and new philosophical insights. It highlights the fragile nature of human perception and reminds us that reality may be far stranger than we assume. The incompleteness theorems. Gödel's incompleteness theorems, developed by Kurt Gödel in 1931, revolutionized mathematics and logic by proving that no formal system can be both complete and consistent. These theorems challenge the idea that mathematical truths can be fully proven using a fixed set of logical rules. The first theorem states that any sufficiently complex mathematical system contains true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. This means that no matter how advanced our mathematical framework is, there will always be truths that lie beyond formal proof. The second theorem takes this further, showing that no system can prove its own consistency, meaning we can never be absolutely certain that a logical system is free of contradictions. Gödel's work shattered the hopes of mathematical foundationalism, particularly David Hilbert's goal of creating a complete and self-contained mathematical system. These theorems also have profound implications for artificial intelligence, philosophy, and the limits of human knowledge, suggesting that some truths may forever remain beyond formal reasoning. The Frankfurt Cases. The Frankfurt Cases, introduced by philosopher Harry Frankfurt in 1969, challenge the idea that moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise. Traditionally, it was believed that if a person could not have acted differently, they could not be held morally responsible. Frankfurt's thought experiments suggest otherwise. One scenario involves a person, Jones, deciding to commit an action, e.g., pressing a button. Unbeknownst to him, a neuroscientist has implanted a device in his brain that would force him to press the button if he were about to choose otherwise. However, Jones freely chooses to press the button, so the device is never activated, even though he could not have done otherwise, because the device ensured the outcome. Jones still acted of his own volition. Frankfurt Cases support compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism can coexist. They suggest that moral responsibility depends not on alternative possibilities, but on whether an action stems from one's own reasoning. This challenges libertarian free will and remains central to debates on ethics, agency, and determinism. The evolutionary argument against naturalism. The evolutionary argument against naturalism, EAN, developed by Alvin Plantinga, argues that if naturalism and evolution are both true, we have no reason to trust our cognitive faculties, leading to a self-defeating position. Evolution selects for survival and reproduction, not necessarily for truth. If false beliefs provide an adaptive advantage, such as early humans believing in non-existent predators and staying cautious, then our beliefs might not be reliable indicators of reality. If evolution does not guarantee truth-tracking faculties, then the belief in naturalism itself, the view that only the physical world exists, becomes questionable. This argument challenges scientific realism and naturalistic accounts of human reason. Critics argue that while evolution may not guarantee perfect knowledge, it produces cognitive faculties reliable enough for survival and inquiry. Others claim that rational thought emerges from cumulative selection for problem-solving abilities. The aeon remains a major philosophical challenge, questioning whether human reason can be trusted under a purely naturalistic framework or if a theistic explanation is necessary for true rationality. The Cartesian Theater. The Cartesian theater is a metaphor coined by Daniel Dennett to criticize the traditional view of consciousness, which suggests that there is a central place in the brain where experiences are played for an internal observer. This idea originates from René Descartes' dualism, which implies that the mind is separate from the body and that there is a self that watches sensory input like an audience watching a movie. Dennett argues that this model is deeply flawed. Neuroscience shows that there is no single place in the brain where all information converges before becoming conscious. Instead, consciousness arises from distributed neural processes working simultaneously without a central observer. This leads to Dennett's multiple drafts model, which suggests that our experiences are constantly edited and revised by different parts of the brain rather than being presented in a single theater of the mind. The Cartesian theater remains a key concept in debates about the nature of consciousness, highlighting the illusion that there is a single self inside our brains, watching reality unfold. The extended mind hypothesis. The extended mind hypothesis, proposed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers, argues that the mind is not confined to the brain, but extends into the external world through tools, technology, and the environment. If external objects play a fundamental role in cognitive processes, they should be considered part of the mind itself. A classic example is notebooks or smartphones. If a person with memory loss relies on a notebook to store important information, then that notebook functions as an extension of their mind. Similarly, when people use calculators, GPS devices, or even social interactions to process information, these tools become part of their cognitive system. This challenges traditional views of cognition as occurring solely in the brain, suggesting instead that thought and memory can be distributed across external systems. Critics argue that external tools are merely aids, not actual parts of cognition. However, proponents claim that if something actively participates in thinking, it should be considered part of the thinking process itself. The extended mind hypothesis has major implications for artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and human-computer interaction, reshaping how we define intelligence and cognitive boundaries. Phenomenology. Phenomenology is a philosophical approach that studies how we experience reality from a first-person perspective. Instead of focusing on objective facts, phenomenology explores consciousness, perception, and lived experience, asking what it means to be aware of something. Founded by Edmund Husserl, phenomenology seeks to describe experiences as they appear, free from assumptions or interpretations. For example, rather than asking, "What is a tree?" in a scientific sense, a phenomenologist asks, "What is it like to experience a tree?" This shift moves philosophy away from external reality and toward the structure of subjective experience. Husserl's student Martin Heidegger expanded phenomenology into existentialism, exploring concepts like being, time, and authenticity. Later thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty applied phenomenology to selfhood, embodiment, and freedom. Phenomenology remains influential in psychology, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence as it challenges us to understand the world not just as it exists, but as it is lived and perceived. The Gavagai problem. The Gavagai problem, introduced by Willard Van Orman Quine, is a challenge in linguistics and philosophy of language that questions how we determine the meaning of words when learning a new language. It highlights the difficulty of translating words without assuming hidden meanings. Imagine an anthropologist encountering a foreign tribe and hearing a native point at a rabbit while saying Gavagai. The anthropologist might assume this means rabbit. However, it could just as easily mean animal, food, white fur, moving thing, or even rabbit spirit. Without more context, it is impossible to determine the exact meaning. This problem challenges the idea that words have fixed meanings independent of interpretation. It suggests that language learning relies on context, cultural background, and assumptions, making translation a more complex and uncertain process than we often realize. The Gavagai problem remains central to semantics, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science, emphasizing that meaning is not just about words, but also about the frameworks we use to interpret them. The argument from moral disagreement. The argument from moral disagreement suggests that the persistence of deep moral disagreements across cultures and individuals challenges the idea of objective moral truths. If morality were objective, like mathematics or physics, we would expect widespread agreement. Instead, history shows persistent conflicts over issues such as human rights, justice, and ethical values. Moral relativists use this argument to claim that morality is subjective, shaped by culture, history, and personal perspective. They argue that moral truths are not absolute, but instead socially constructed and influenced by factors like upbringing and environment. However, moral realists argue that disagreement does not imply the absence of objective truth. Just because people disagree about scientific facts does not mean those facts do not exist. Some claim that moral truths exist independently of human opinion, but that people struggle to recognize them due to bias, misinformation, or self-interest. The argument from moral disagreement remains central in metaethics, shaping debates about whether morality is an objective reality or a human invention. The Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed by James Lovelock in the 1970s, suggests that Earth functions as a self-regulating, living system that maintains conditions favorable for life. This idea challenges traditional views of Earth as a passive environment, instead proposing that biological and geological systems interact to stabilize the planet. One key example is how plants and microorganisms help regulate atmospheric oxygen. Without life, oxygen levels could fluctuate dramatically, making Earth uninhabitable. Similarly, ocean salinity has remained remarkably stable over millions of years, despite processes that should have made it too salty for life, suggesting that living organisms play a role in maintaining equilibrium. Critics argue that the Gaia hypothesis overstates Earth's ability to self-regulate, noting that life is vulnerable to mass extinctions and climate changes. However, modern Earth system science incorporates aspects of the hypothesis, recognizing that life and environment evolve together in complex feedback loops. The Gaia hypothesis remains influential in ecology, climate science, and sustainability, encouraging a holistic view of Earth as an interconnected system rather than a mere collection of separate parts. Searle's biological naturalism. Searle's biological naturalism, proposed by John Searle, argues that consciousness is both a biological phenomenon and irreducible to purely physical explanations. Unlike materialists who claim that consciousness is nothing more than brain activity, and dualists who believe mind and body are separate, Searle holds that consciousness emerges from the brain's biological processes but cannot be fully explained in purely computational or physical terms. Searle rejects strong AI, arguing that no digital system can truly understand or experience consciousness because computation alone does not produce subjective awareness. He sees consciousness as a higher-order property of biological systems, like how water's liquidity arises from molecular interactions. However, he insists that consciousness is still fully natural, not supernatural or mysterious, just something we don't yet fully understand. Critics argue that Searle's view does not clearly explain how neural activity produces subjective experience. Despite this, his theory remains influential in debates about mind-body relations, artificial intelligence, and the nature of subjective experience. Hyperobjects. Hyperobjects, a concept developed by Timothy Morton, refer to entities that are so vast in time and space that they exceed human perception and control. Examples include climate change, global capitalism, the internet, and nuclear radiation. These objects exist all around us, but are difficult to fully grasp because they are too large, distributed, or complex for any single perspective to comprehend. A key feature of hyperobjects is that they persist over massive timescales. Climate change, for instance, unfolds over centuries, yet its effects are immediate. Another feature is that they entangle everything. Humans are part of hyperobjects but cannot escape their influence, much like how every breath contains molecules from past centuries. Hyperobjects challenge traditional philosophical ideas about human agency, ethics, and reality, suggesting that we must rethink our role in a world shaped by forces beyond individual control. They are central to discussions on ecology, technology, and the Anthropocene, forcing us to confront the overwhelming scale of modern global challenges. The paradox of fiction. The paradox of fiction questions why we feel real emotions for fictional characters and events, even though we know they are not real. This paradox arises because, logically, emotions are typically based on beliefs about reality, yet people cry over tragic movies, fear monsters in horror films, or feel joy when their favorite book character succeeds. The paradox has three conflicting ideas. 1. We only feel emotions about things we believe to be real. 2. We know that fictional characters and events are not real. 3. Yet, we still experience genuine emotions toward them. Several theories attempt to resolve this. The pretend theory suggests that we are not truly feeling emotions, but rather simulating them. The thought theory argues that imagining a situation is enough to trigger real emotional responses. Others claim that emotions arise because fiction connects to universal human experiences, making it psychologically real, even if it's not physically real. The paradox of fiction remains central in aesthetics, psychology, and media studies, raising questions about how imagination and emotions interact. The scandal of induction. The scandal of induction refers to the long-standing problem in philosophy of science regarding why inductive reasoning works despite having no logical guarantee. First outlined by David Hume, the issue arises because inductive reasoning, drawing general conclusions from past observations, relies on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. However, there is no logical proof that this assumption is always true. For example, we assume the sun will rise tomorrow because it always has. But logically, past occurrences do not guarantee future outcomes. This leads to a paradox. We justify induction by pointing to its past success, but that itself is an inductive argument, making it circular reasoning. Philosophers have attempted to solve this problem in various ways. Karl Popper proposed falsificationism, where scientific theories are tested not by proving them true, but by trying to disprove them. Others argue that induction works pragmatically, meaning it is useful even if we cannot justify it formally. The scandal of induction remains one of the biggest challenges in epistemology and the philosophy of science, as it questions whether human knowledge is built on certainty or just practical habit. Moral dumbfounding. Moral dumbfounding refers to situations where people strongly believe that something is morally wrong, but struggle to justify why when asked to provide logical reasoning. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues popularized the concept through experiments showing that people often rely on gut feelings rather than rational arguments when making moral judgments. For example, in a study, participants were presented with harmless yet taboo scenarios, such as a brother and sister engaging in consensual but secret incest with no consequences. Most people immediately judged the act as wrong, but struggled to explain why, often resorting to phrases like, "It just feels wrong." This suggests that moral reasoning is often post hoc, meaning people form emotional reactions first and then try to justify them with logic. Moral dumbfounding challenges the idea that morality is purely rational. It supports moral intuitionism, which argues that deep-seated emotions and social conditioning shape moral beliefs more than logical analysis. The concept has implications for ethics, psychology, and political discourse, highlighting how moral judgments often go beyond rational argumentation. Boltzmann brains. The Boltzmann brain hypothesis is a paradox in cosmology and statistical mechanics that questions whether it is more likely that the universe we experience is real, or that we are just disembodied brains floating in a vast, chaotic cosmos. The idea comes from Ludwig Boltzmann's work on entropy and randomness in the universe. According to thermodynamics, random fluctuations in an infinite or long-lived universe can, given enough time, produce complex structures purely by chance. If the universe is truly infinite, then it should be far more likely for a single brain with false memories to spontaneously form in the void than for an entire orderly universe to exist through gradual cosmic evolution. If true, this would mean that our reality, our memories, and everything we experience could be an illusion formed by chance rather than physical laws. The Boltzmann brain paradox raises fundamental questions about the reliability of perception, the nature of consciousness, and the fine-tuning of the universe. Most physicists reject the idea, arguing that if we were just Boltzmann brains, our experiences would be far more chaotic and meaningless than they appear. However, the paradox remains a thought-provoking challenge to our assumptions about existence and probability in an infinite cosmos. Deontic logic. Deontic logic is a branch of logic that examines obligations, permissions, and prohibitions, providing a structured way to analyze moral and legal reasoning. Unlike classical logic, which focuses on truth and falsity, deontic logic deals with what ought to be done. It evaluates statements such as, "one must tell the truth," or "stealing is forbidden," helping philosophers and ethicists formalize ethical discussions. This logic assigns specific symbols to different types of normative statements. For example, obligations are represented as necessary actions, while permissions indicate choices that are allowed but not required. This framework is widely used in moral philosophy, legal theory, and artificial intelligence, particularly in programming ethical algorithms for autonomous systems. However, deontic logic also faces paradoxes, such as conflicting moral duties where one obligation contradicts another. Questions arise about whether absolute moral rules can exist, or if ethical decisions must always be context-dependent. Deontic logic remains a critical tool for understanding moral responsibility and ethical decision-making, offering a precise method for discussing normative principles in law, ethics, and philosophy. The problem of dirty hands. The problem of dirty hands is a moral dilemma that explores whether individuals, particularly leaders, can be justified in committing immoral actions for the sake of a greater good. It appears in politics, warfare, and governance, where decisions often involve choosing between two morally troubling outcomes. Philosopher Michael Walzer describes this problem in situations where political leaders must engage in morally questionable acts, such as lying, manipulation, or even violence, to protect society or achieve a noble goal. A common example is whether torturing a terrorist to prevent an attack is justifiable. While torture is widely condemned, allowing mass casualties may seem like the greater evil, creating an ethical paradox where both choices are morally tainted. This dilemma challenges deontological ethics, which insists on absolute moral rules, while aligning more with consequentialism, which evaluates morality based on outcomes. It raises profound questions about whether morality should remain rigid in extreme situations or whether ethical flexibility is sometimes necessary. The problem of dirty hands remains a central issue in political philosophy, ethics, and real-world decision-making, forcing society to confront the moral costs of leadership and governance.